In the silence before dawn, when mist clings to ancient stone and the world holds its breath between darkness and light, the mountains remember. They remember the first footsteps that climbed their slopes with trembling reverence, the first voices that whispered prayers into thin air, the first hands that built altars from their bones. Across continents and centuries, these silent sentinels have watched civilizations rise and fall like shadows cast by passing clouds, their peaks touching mysteries that mortals could only dream of reaching. Tonight, as sleep calls to weary souls, we ascend these sacred heights through memory and dream, where the boundary between earth and heaven dissolves into something both ancient and eternal. If this journey into history gently moves you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here. By the way, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off. We read every single one. Before the first temple was carved from living rock, before the first prayer was carried on mountain winds, there was something in the human soul that answered the call of heights. Perhaps it began with that moment when early humans first glimpsed a distant peak rising impossibly tall against the sky, its summit lost in clouds that seemed to bridge the gap between the known world and whatever lay beyond. In that moment of recognition, something profound stirred within the human spirit, a longing that would shape the destiny of civilizations yet unborn. The mountains chose their worshippers as much as they were chosen. Across the ancient world, from the snow-crowned peaks of the Himalayas to the volcanic heights of the Andes, from the weathered summits of Sinai to the mist-shrouded mountains of ancient China, there emerged a pattern as old as human consciousness itself. These were not mere geological formations to be conquered or crossed, but sacred presences that demanded reverence, offering transformation to those brave enough to seek them out. In the pre-dawn hours of human civilization, when the line between myth and memory had not yet been drawn, the mountains served as cosmic pillars holding up the sky. They were the dwelling places of gods, the birthplaces of rivers, the keepers of weather, and the guardians of wisdom too dangerous for the valleys. Below, each culture that encountered these towering presences wove them into the very fabric of their spiritual understanding, creating mythologies so powerful that their echoes still resonate in the collective unconscious today. The ancient Sumerians, dwelling in the flat river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, carried within their cultural memory the mountains of their ancestors. Though they built their ziggurats from clay and brick, these stepped pyramids were conscious attempts to recreate the sacred mountain experience in a landscape where natural peaks were merely distant dreams. Each ziggurat was an artificial mountain, its summit reaching toward the heavens where the gods might descend to meet with mortals. The word ziggurat itself meant mountain peak in their ancient tongue, a linguistic fossil preserving humanity's primal connection to sacred heights. But it was not enough to simply build imitations of mountains. The human soul required the authentic experience of ascent, the physical and spiritual challenge of climbing toward the divine. And so began the great pilgrimages, the sacred journeys that would define the spiritual landscape of the ancient world. These were not casual adventures, but profound rituals of transformation, undertaken by individuals willing to risk everything for a glimpse of the transcendent. Mount Kailash, rising like a crystalline mandala from the remote reaches of Tibet, became perhaps the most revered peak in human history. Four of the world's great religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and the ancient Bon tradition, recognized this solitary summit as the axis mundi, the center of the universe around which all existence revolves. For Hindus, it was the eternal dwelling place of Lord Shiva, the cosmic dancer whose movements maintained the rhythm of creation and destruction. Buddhists saw it as the earthly manifestation of Mount Meru, the mythical mountain at the center of Buddhist cosmology. Yet despite its overwhelming spiritual significance, or perhaps because of it, Kailash remained unclimbed, its summit forbidden to all but the gods. The pilgrimage around Kailash, known as the Kora, became one of the most challenging and transformative spiritual journeys on earth. Pilgrims would travel for months or even years to reach this remote peak, carrying with them the accumulated prayers and hopes of entire communities. The 32-mile circuit around the mountain's base was typically completed in 3 days, though the most devout would prostrate themselves full length with every step, a practice that could extend the journey 2 weeks. Each turn of the path revealed new vistas of the sacred mountain, each view another meditation on the nature of the divine presence dwelling within stone and ice. The physical challenge of the Kora was nothing compared to its spiritual demands. At elevations where oxygen was scarce and weather could turn deadly without warning, pilgrims were stripped of all pretense and comfort, reduced to their essential selves in the presence of something infinitely greater. Many reported profound visions during their circumambulation, moments when the boundary between self and mountain, between individual consciousness and cosmic awareness, seemed to dissolve entirely. These experiences were not mere hallucinations brought on by altitude and exhaustion, but glimpses into the true nature of reality that the sacred mountains had always guarded. Yet Kailash was only one of countless peaks that served as bridges between the human and divine realms. Mount Sinai, rising abruptly from the desert sands of the Sinai Peninsula, became the mountain of revelation for 3 of the world's great monotheistic traditions. Here, according to ancient texts, Moses received the 10 Commandments directly from the divine presence, the mountain itself trembling with supernatural power as the covenant between God and humanity was forged in fire and thunder. The very rocks of Sinai seemed to retain the memory of that encounter, drawing pilgrims and seekers for millennia who came seeking their own moments of divine revelation. The approach to Sinai was a journey through increasing levels of the sacred. Pilgrims would begin their ascent in the pre-dawn darkness, following ancient paths worn smooth by countless feet over thousands of years. The lower slopes were relatively gentle, allowing time for contemplation and preparation. But as the path grew steeper and the air thinner, each step became a conscious choice to continue upward, away from the comfortable familiarity of the valley floor toward an encounter with the luminous. The summit of Sinai was marked not by any human construction, but by the raw presence of the mountain itself. Here, in the silence before dawn, pilgrims would wait for the sun to rise over the desert, transforming the barren landscape below into a sea of gold and shadow. In that moment of transformation, many reported feeling a profound connection to the countless generations who had made this same journey, seeking the same divine encounter. The mountain became a bridge across time as well as space, linking the present moment to the foundational experiences of human spirituality that in the far east, the sacred mountains took on different but equally profound meanings. Mount Fuji, its perfect volcanic cone, reflected in still lakes and celebrated in countless works of art, became the embodiment of natural perfection and divine harmony. The mountain was not merely a physical presence, but a spiritual teacher, its changing moods throughout the seasons serving as lessons in impermanence and beauty. Pilgrims climbing Fuji's slopes participated in an ancient dialogue between human consciousness and natural forces, learning to find their place within the larger patterns of existence. The tradition of mountain pilgrimage in Japan was formalized into the practice of yamabushi, warrior monks who spent years in the mountains developing spiritual powers through extreme physical and mental discipline. These practitioners understood that the mountains were not mere settings for spiritual practice but active participants in the process of transformation. Each peak had its own character, its own lessons to teach, its own way of stripping away illusion and revealing truth. The Yamabushi learned to read the mountain's moods, to sense the presence of Kamitha, divine spirits dwelling within natural forms, and to align their own energy with the cosmic forces flowing through stone and sky. The practice of mountain asceticism spread throughout the Buddhist world, taking on unique characteristics in each culture, while maintaining its essential purpose, the transformation of consciousness through direct encounter with the sacred power of heights. In the Himalayas, cave-dwelling yogis spent decades in solitary meditation on remote peaks, their bodies growing thin as their consciousness expanded to encompass the vast spaces around them. These hermits were not escaping from the world, but diving deeper into its essential nature, using the mountains as laboratories for exploring the furthest reaches of human potential, long before the great religions codified their sacred geographies. There were those who heard the mountains calling and answered with their feet. These first pilgrims were not following established paths or seeking to fulfill religious obligations, but responding to something far more primal, recognition that certain places on earth held power beyond the ordinary, power that could transform those brave enough to seek it out. In the silence before dawn, when mist clings to ancient stone and the world holds its breath between darkness and light, the mountains remember. They remember the first footsteps that climbed their slopes with trembling reverence, the first voices that whispered prayers into thin air, the first hands that built altars from their bones. Across continents and centuries, these silent sentinels have watched civilizations rise and fall like shadows cast by passing clouds, their peaks touching mysteries that mortals could only dream of reaching. Tonight, as sleep calls to weary souls, we ascend these sacred heights through memory and dream, where the boundary between earth and heaven dissolves into something both ancient and eternal. If this journey into history gently moves you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here. By the way, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off. We read every single one. Before the first temple was carved from living rock, before the first prayer was carried on mountain winds, there was something in the human soul that answered the call of heights. Perhaps it began with that moment when early humans first glimpsed a distant peak rising impossibly tall against the sky, its summit lost in clouds that seemed to bridge the gap between the known world and whatever lay beyond. In that moment of recognition, something profound stirred within the human spirit, a longing that would shape the destiny of civilizations yet unborn. The mountains chose their worshippers as much as they were chosen. Across the ancient world, from the snow-crowned peaks of the Himalayas to the volcanic heights of the Andes, from the weathered summits of Sinai to the mist-shrouded mountains of ancient China, there emerged a pattern as old as human consciousness itself. These were not mere geological formations to be conquered or crossed, but sacred presences that demanded reverence, offering transformation to those brave enough to seek them out. In the pre-dawn hours of human civilization, when the line between myth and memory had not yet been drawn, the mountains served as cosmic pillars holding up the sky. They were the dwelling places of gods, the birthplaces of rivers, the keepers of weather, and the guardians of wisdom too dangerous for the valleys. Below, each culture that encountered these towering presences wove them into the very fabric of their spiritual understanding, creating mythologies so powerful that their echoes still resonate in the collective unconscious today. The ancient Sumerians, dwelling in the flat river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, carried within their cultural memory the mountains of their ancestors. Though they built their ziggurats from clay and brick, these stepped pyramids were conscious attempts to recreate the sacred mountain experience in a landscape where natural peaks were merely distant dreams. Each ziggurat was an artificial mountain, its summit reaching toward the heavens where the gods might descend to meet with mortals. The word ziggurat itself meant mountain peak in their ancient tongue, a linguistic fossil preserving humanity's primal connection to sacred heights. But it was not enough to simply build imitations of mountains. The human soul required the authentic experience of ascent, the physical and spiritual challenge of climbing toward the divine. And so began the great pilgrimages, the sacred journeys that would define the spiritual landscape of the ancient world. These were not casual adventures, but profound rituals of transformation, undertaken by individuals willing to risk everything for a glimpse of the transcendent. Mount Kailash, rising like a crystalline mandala from the remote reaches of Tibet, became perhaps the most revered peak in human history. Four of the world's great religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and the ancient Bun tradition, recognized this solitary summit as the axis mundi, the center of the universe around which all existence revolves. For Hindus, it was the eternal dwelling place of Lord Shiva, the cosmic dancer whose movements maintained the rhythm of creation and destruction. Buddhists saw it as the earthly manifestation of Mount Meru, the mythical mountain at the center of Buddhist cosmology. Yet despite its overwhelming spiritual significance, or perhaps because of it, Kailash remained unclimbed, its summit forbidden to all but the gods. The pilgrimage around Kailash, known as the Kora, became one of the most challenging and transformative spiritual journeys on earth. Pilgrims would travel for months or even years to reach this remote peak, carrying with them the accumulated prayers and hopes of entire communities. The 32-mile circuit around the mountain's base was typically completed in 3 days, though the most devout would prostrate themselves full length with every step, a practice that could extend the journey 2 weeks. Each turn of the path revealed new vistas of the sacred mountain, each view another meditation on the nature of the divine presence dwelling within stone and ice. The physical challenge of the Kora was nothing compared to its spiritual demands. At elevations where oxygen was scarce and weather could turn deadly without warning, pilgrims were stripped of all pretense and comfort, reduced to their essential selves in the presence of something infinitely greater. Many reported profound visions during their circumambulation, moments when the boundary between self and mountain, between individual consciousness and cosmic awareness, seemed to dissolve entirely. These experiences were not mere hallucinations brought on by altitude and exhaustion, but glimpses into the true nature of reality that the sacred mountains had always guarded. Yet Kailash was only one of countless peaks that served as bridges between the human and divine realms. Mount Sinai, rising abruptly from the desert sands of the Sinai Peninsula, became the mountain of revelation for 3 of the world's great monotheistic traditions. Here, according to ancient texts, Moses received the 10 Commandments directly from the divine presence, the mountain itself trembling with supernatural power as the covenant between God and humanity was forged in fire and thunder. The very rocks of Sinai seemed to retain the memory of that encounter, drawing pilgrims and seekers for millennia who came seeking their own moments of divine revelation. The approach to Sinai was a journey through increasing levels of the sacred. Pilgrims would begin their ascent in the pre-dawn darkness, following ancient paths worn smooth by countless feet over thousands of years. The lower slopes were relatively gentle, allowing time for contemplation and preparation. But as the path grew steeper and the air thinner, each step became a conscious choice to continue upward, away from the comfortable familiarity of the valley floor toward an encounter with the luminous. The summit of Sinai was marked not by any human construction, but by the raw presence of the mountain itself. Here, in the silence before dawn, pilgrims would wait for the sun to rise over the desert, transforming the barren landscape below into a sea of gold and shadow. In that moment of transformation, many reported feeling a profound connection to the countless generations who had made this same journey, seeking the same divine encounter. The mountain became a bridge across time as well as space, linking the present moment to the foundational experiences of human spirituality that in the far east, the sacred mountains took on different but equally profound meanings. Mount Fuji, its perfect volcanic cone, reflected in still lakes and celebrated in countless works of art, became the embodiment of natural perfection and divine harmony. The mountain was not merely a physical presence, but a spiritual teacher, its changing moods throughout the seasons serving as lessons in impermanence and beauty. Pilgrims climbing Fuji's slopes participated in an ancient dialogue between human consciousness and natural forces, learning to find their place within the larger patterns of existence. The tradition of mountain pilgrimage in Japan was formalized into the practice of yamabushi, warrior monks who spent years in the mountains developing spiritual powers through extreme physical and mental discipline. These practitioners understood that the mountains were not mere settings for spiritual practice but active participants in the process of transformation. Each peak had its own character, its own lessons to teach, its own way of stripping away illusion and revealing truth. The Yamabushi learned to read the mountain's moods, to sense the presence of Kamitha, divine spirits dwelling within natural forms, and to align their own energy with the cosmic forces flowing through stone and sky. The practice of mountain asceticism spread throughout the Buddhist world, taking on unique characteristics in each culture, while maintaining its essential purpose, the transformation of consciousness through direct encounter with the sacred power of heights. In the Himalayas, cave-dwelling yogis spent decades in solitary meditation on remote peaks, their bodies growing thin as their consciousness expanded to encompass the vast spaces around them. These hermits were not escaping from the world, but diving deeper into its essential nature, using the mountains as laboratories for exploring the furthest reaches of human potential, long before the great religions codified their sacred geographies. There were those who heard the mountains calling and answered with their feet. These first pilgrims were not following established paths or seeking to fulfill religious obligations, but responding to something far more primal, recognition that certain places on earth held power beyond the ordinary, power that could transform those brave enough to seek it out. The psychological and spiritual preparation for these extreme mountain pilgrimages was as intensive as the physical training. Inca priests and priestesses who served the mountain shrines underwent years of purification rituals, dietary restrictions, and meditation practices designed to refine their consciousness to the point where direct communication with the APU became possible. These spiritual athletes, for lack of a better term, represented the pinnacle of human development within their culture. Individuals who had transcended ordinary human limitations to serve as bridges between the earthly and divine realms. In the silence of high altitudes, where the air grows thin and every breath becomes a conscious act, the mountains speak in a language older than words. It is a language written in the slow patience of stone, whispered in the eternal conversation between earth and sky, and decoded by those who have learned to listen with more than their ears. The first pilgrims who climbed these sacred peaks discovered that mountains communicate not through sound but through presence, not through explanation but through direct transmission of wisdom that bypasses the rational mind entirely. This ancient language of peaks and precipices was understood by diverse cultures across the globe, each developing their own methods of interpretation while recognizing the universal nature of the mountain's message. The Tibetan tradition of reading the landscape as a sacred text known as siyij, or earth writing, represented one of the most sophisticated systems for understanding the spiritual significance of geological formations. Practitioners of this art could read the curves of valleys, the orientation of ridges, and the placement of peaks as clearly as scholars read written manuscripts, finding in the landscape a direct revelation of cosmic principles. The process of learning to read this earth writing required years of training under master practitioners who had spent their lives studying the subtle relationships between consciousness and landscape. Students would begin by learning to recognize the basic letters of the mountain alphabet, the way morning light fell across certain slopes, the patterns of snow accumulation on different faces, the behavior of clouds around various peaks. These seemingly simple observations were actually keys to understanding the energetic qualities of different mountain features and their effects on human consciousness. Advanced practitioners of earth writing could determine the most auspicious locations for meditation retreats, the proper times for beginning pilgrimage journeys, and even the spiritual destiny of individuals based on their relationship to specific landscape features. This was not superstition, but a sophisticated science of consciousness that recognized the profound interconnection between inner and outer environments. The mountains were understood to be vast teaching devices, their very structure designed to evoke specific states of awareness in those who approach them with proper understanding. The Celtic Druids developed a parallel system for interpreting the spiritual significance of mountains and hills. Though their methods were adapted to the gentler peaks of the British Isles, they understood that each hill and mountain possessed its own genius loci, guardian spirit that embodied the unique wisdom and power of that particular place. The Druids' approach to mountain pilgrimage was fundamentally about learning to communicate with these landscape spirits, to understand their messages and receive their teachings. The Celtic tradition placed great emphasis on the timing of mountain encounters, recognizing that the same peak could offer completely different teachings depending on the season, the weather, and the pilgrim's state of mind. The great ceremonial centres like Tara in Ireland and Cadbury in England were positioned to facilitate communication with the spirits of nearby hills, creating sacred dialogues between human communities and the landscape powers that sustained them. These were not one-way conversations, but genuine exchanges, with the human communities offering their devotion and service in return for the wisdom and protection of the land spirits. The practice of divination from mountain features, what the Romans called augury, and the Celts knew as various forms of natural magic, represented another way of accessing the mountain's ancient wisdom. Observers would study the behavior of birds around mountain peaks, the formation of clouds on distant summits, and the patterns of weather moving across the heights to gain insight into future events and divine will. This was not mere fortune-telling, but a sophisticated, understanding of how the subtle energies flowing through the landscape influenced the unfolding of events in human affairs. In the mountains of ancient Greece, this practice of reading divine messages in the landscape reached perhaps its most sophisticated expression at the Oracle of Delphi. The sacred site was positioned on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where a unique combination of geological and energetic factors created conditions conducive to prophetic visions. The oracle herself was understood to be a translator of the mountain's wisdom, her prophetic utterances arising from her deep attunement to the sacred forces flowing through the landscape. The process of consultation at Delphi involved careful preparation and purification rituals that aligned the seeker's consciousness with the mountain's energy. Pilgrims would climb the sacred way up the slopes of Parnassus, participating in increasingly intense ritual activities designed to open their awareness to non-ordinary states of consciousness. By the time they reached the temple complex, they were no longer operating from ordinary rational consciousness, but from a heightened state of receptivity that allowed them to receive the mountain's teachings. The famous ambiguity of the Delphic oracles was not a failure of communication, but a reflection of the mountain's teaching style. Like all great teachers, the mountain did not provide easy answers, but offered guidance that required the seeker to participate actively in the process of understanding. The oracular pronouncements were seeds of wisdom that would grow and develop in the seeker's consciousness over time, revealing new layers of meaning as the individual's understanding deepened. This principle of participatory revelation was fundamental to all authentic mountain teachings. The peaks did not offer their wisdom to passive recipients, but required active engagement, genuine seeking, and often considerable sacrifice from those who would learn from them. The wisdom of the mountains was not information to be acquired, but transformation to be experienced. Not knowledge to be memorized, but understanding to be embodied. Through direct encounter with the sacred forces dwelling in stone and sky, the development of monastery traditions on mountain peaks throughout the ancient world represented an attempt to create permanent institutions for accessing and preserving mountain wisdom. The great monasteries of Tibet, perched impossibly on cliff faces and mountain ledges, were positioned not for defensive purposes, but to maintain constant contact with the spiritual energies flowing through the peaks. The monks who inhabited these aerial monasteries understood that their primary function was not to withdraw from the world, but to serve as translators of mountain wisdom for the benefit of all beings. The daily life of mountain monasteries was organized around the rhythms of the peaks themselves. Meditation schedules followed the movement of shadows across the cliffs. Ceremonial activities were timed to coincide with the play of light on distant summits, and the community's spiritual calendar was determined by the seasonal changes in the mountain environment. This was not mere poetic sensitivity, but practical wisdom that recognized how deeply human consciousness is influenced by environmental factors. The architectural traditions that developed around mountain monasteries reflected a sophisticated understanding of how built environments could enhance or diminish the mountain's teaching power. Tibetan monastery design incorporated principles of sacred geometry that amplified the natural energies of the mountain setting, creating spaces where the boundary between inner and outer awareness could dissolve more easily. The famous monastery of Rongbuk, positioned near the base of Mount Everest, was designed as a lens that focused the spiritual power of the great peak into spaces where human consciousness could more readily absorb its influence. The decline of these mountain wisdom traditions in many parts of the world represents one of humanity's great losses. As cultures became more urbanized and disconnected from the natural world, the ability to read the language of stone and sky gradually faded. The mountains continued to speak, but fewer and fewer humans retained the ability to understand their message. Modern pilgrimage to sacred peaks often lacks the deep preparation and cultural context that allowed ancient seekers to access the full depth of mountain wisdom. Yet the mountains themselves remain unchanged, their ancient wisdom intact, and available to those who approach them with proper understanding and preparation. The language of stone and sky continues to offer its teachings to anyone willing to learn its grammar of silence, patience, and direct perception. In an age of increasing disconnection from the natural world, the recovery of mountain wisdom may be essential for the spiritual and psychological health of human civilization. The process of learning to communicate with mountains requires a fundamental shift in consciousness, away from the analytical, verbal thinking that dominates modern life, toward a more intuitive, receptive mode of awareness. This is not anti-intellectual, but pre-intellectual, a return to ways of knowing that predate the development of written language and abstract thought. The mountains offer teachings that cannot be captured in books or transmitted through words, but must be received directly through the senses and absorbed into the depths of being. Contemporary neuroscience is beginning to validate what ancient mountain pilgrims always knew, that high-altitude environments create unique conditions for altered states of consciousness and enhanced spiritual awareness. The combination of reduced oxygen, dramatic visual perspectives, and isolation from familiar environments appears to facilitate access to non-ordinary states of consciousness that ancient pilgrims sought through their challenging journeys to sacred peaks. The mountains, it seems, are natural laboratories for exploring the furthest reaches of human consciousness. The morning mist that clung to Kailash spoke in tongues older than Sanskrit, older than the first prayer wheels that would one day spin. In the hands of pilgrims who understood that some places on earth served as bridges between what is seen and what is felt but never fully grasped. Here, in the trans-Himalayan silence, where the air grew thin enough to hold dreams, the mountain revealed itself not as mere stone and snow, but as a living mandala carved from the earth's deepest meditation. For the Tibetans, Kailash was the precious snow jewel, a name that rolled off tongues like a prayer itself. The Hindus called it the earthly manifestation of Mount Meru, the cosmic axis around which all existence spun its eternal dance. To walk the Kora, the ritual circumambulation of its base, was to step outside time itself, to join a procession that had begun before memory and would continue long after the last human footprint dissolved in the mountain snows. But what the pilgrims could not see, what their reverent eyes missed in their focused devotion, were the older marks upon the mountain's face, carved symbols that predated Buddhism, predated Hinduism, predated the very concept of organized pilgrimage. These were the signatures of the Bonpo, the practitioners of Tibet's ancient shamanic tradition, who had recognized the mountain's power long before the first Buddhist monk set foot on the high plateau. The Bonpo understood something that later traditions would obscure in their systematic theologies, that mountains were not metaphors for the divine, but actual repositories of consciousness, vast stone mines that held the accumulated wisdom of millennia in their crystalline structures. They believed that certain peaks, like Kailash, were the physical bodies of primordial deities, sleeping gods whose dreams became the weather, whose breath was the wind that carved the valleys and shaped the clouds. In the pre-dawn darkness of a Tibetan winter, when the mountain stood silhouetted against a sky heavy with unborn snow, The Bon shamans would begin their ascent not with their feet, but with their spirits. They called it wind horse riding, a practice of projecting consciousness beyond the boundaries of the physical body to commune directly with the mountain's awareness. These were not metaphorical journeys, but actual explorations of non-ordinary reality, guided by techniques passed down through oral tradition across countless generations. The shamans spoke of encountering, within the mountain's spiritual geography, vast halls of crystal where the voices of the ancestors continued their conversations, discussing the movements of civilizations as if they were weather patterns, ephemeral and cyclical. They described libraries of stone where the mountain recorded not just the prayers of pilgrims, but the deeper currents of human longing that drove people to seek the sacred in high places. These encounters left their mark in more than memory. The returning shamans would often display physical evidence of their spiritual journeys, hands stained with colors that had no earthly equivalent, voices that carried new harmonics as if they had learned to speak in the mountain's own frequency. Some returned with small stones that they claimed were gifts from the mountain itself, pebbles that seemed to generate their own faint luminescence in complete darkness. Modern attempts to analyze these stones have yielded curious results. While they appear to be composed of ordinary quartz and feldspar, their crystalline structure displays patterns that shouldn't exist in naturally occurring minerals. The formations seem to suggest that the crystals were subjected to intense pressure and specific vibrational frequencies that current geological understanding cannot explain. Some researchers have theorized that these stones might be the result of previously unknown processes that occur within sacred mountains, phenomena that blend geology with consciousness in ways that Western science has yet to comprehend. The mystery deepens when one considers the consistent reports across cultures and centuries of similar phenomena occurring at other sacred peaks around the world. Mount Sinai, where Moses encountered the burning bush and received the tablets of law, has its own tradition of luminous stones. Bedouin guides speak of finding crystals in certain caves on the mountain slopes that glow with an inner light, particularly during the hours before dawn. These stones, according to local tradition, are fragments of the original fire that burned, without consuming, crystallized remnants of the divine presence that once made the mountain itself a conduit between heaven and earth. The Bedouins described them as tears of the mountain, formed when the peak wept from the intensity of the divine encounter it was called upon to witness. Christian pilgrims to Sinai, particularly those who undertake the traditional night climb to reach the summit for sunrise, sometimes report experiences that echo the Tibetan shamans' accounts. They speak of moments during the ascent when the mountain seems to become transparent, revealing inner chambers filled with golden light where robed figures move in slow procession, carrying scrolls covered in script that seems to write itself, even as it's being observed. These visions, dismissed by skeptics as altitude-induced hallucinations or the product of religious expectation, share remarkable consistency in their details. The figures are always described as scribes or keepers of records, their faces obscured but their movements purposeful, as if they are engaged in the ongoing work of recording humanity's spiritual evolution. The scrolls they carry are said to contain not laws or commandments, but questions, profound inquiries into the nature of existence that each human soul must eventually confront. What makes these accounts particularly intriguing is their occurrence across religious boundaries. Muslim pilgrims climbing Jabal Musa, as they call the mountain, report similar encounters, though they interpret the figures as angels engaged in the continuous act of revelation. Jewish mystics speak of glimpsing the eternal study hall where the Torah is still being received, not as a historical event that happened once, but as an ongoing process of divine communication. The mountain, it seems, serves not just as the location where sacred events occurred, but as a continuing nexus where the boundaries between dimensions remain permeable. This understanding transforms pilgrimage from a simple act of remembrance into a journey toward active participation in the sacred process itself. Across the Mediterranean world, where olive groves descended toward wind-dark seas and marble temples, caught the light of a sun that seemed to dance with the gods themselves. The ancient Greeks understood mountains as the natural dwelling places of divinity, but their sacred peaks held secrets that went beyond the familiar tales of Zeus and his Olympian court. Mysteries that reached back to the pre-Hellenic peoples who first felt the earth's power concentrated in high places. Mount Olympus, the throne of the gods in popular mythology, was indeed venerated by the Greeks, but their deepest spiritual practices centered on mountains that predated their arrival in the region. Mount Lycaon in Arcadia, sacred to Zeus, Lycaon, the wolf god, harbored rituals so ancient and powerful that even in classical times they were spoken of only in whispers. The summit of Lycaon was forbidden ground, a place where no shadows fell, or so the local people claimed, and where human sacrifice might still occur in the darkest hours of night. Archaeological excavations on Lycaon have uncovered evidence of continuous ritual activity spanning more than 3 millennia, with the earliest layers revealing practices that seem to have involved the deliberate burial of offerings in precise geometric patterns around the mountain's peak. These patterns, when mapped, form complex mandalas that align with stellar configurations visible only at certain times of year, suggesting that the mountain served as a kind of cosmic calendar, its ritual landscape encoding astronomical knowledge. In stone and earth, the offerings themselves tell a story of gradually changing spiritual practices. The deepest, oldest layers contain items that speak of shamanic traditions: bear claws arranged in spirals, stones with naturally occurring holes that served as windows between worlds, and most mysteriously, small clay figurines with deliberately obscured faces, as if their makers understood that some divine encounters required anonymity. As the layers progress upward through time, the offerings become more sophisticated, but also more standardized, reflecting the organized religion that replaced the older, more personal spiritual practices. Bronze tripods appear, the kind used by oracles to receive divine messages. Gold wreaths begin to show up, markers of institutionalized worship rather than individual vision quests. The mountain was gradually transformed from a place of direct spiritual encounter into a formal religious site, managed by priests rather than experienced by seekers. Yet the older power never fully disappeared. Even during the height of classical Greek civilization, certain individuals continued to seek direct communion with the mountain's consciousness, using methods that had been passed down through oral tradition since the Bronze Age. These practitioners, known as the mountain walkers, were not formally recognized by official religious institutions, but they were tacitly tolerated because of their reputation for accurate prophecy. The mountain walkers believed that each sacred peak held what they called a memory crystal at its heart, a naturally occurring formation that recorded not just geological events, but emotional and spiritual ones as well. By learning to resonate with these crystals through specific combinations of movement, sound, and mental discipline, an experienced practitioner could access the mountain's accumulated wisdom, experiencing directly the insights and revelations of all those who had sought the sacred in that place before. The process was neither simple nor safe. Training began in childhood and took decades to master. Students learned first to recognize the subtle vibrations that different types of stone produced when touched with focused intention. They studied the way sound traveled through rock formations, discovering that mountains possessed acoustic properties that could amplify human consciousness under the right conditions. They practiced forms of moving meditation that synchronized their bodily rhythms with the geological processes occurring deep within the earth. The ultimate goal was to achieve what they called stone dreaming, a state of consciousness in which the practitioner's awareness could temporarily merge with the mountain's geological memory, experiencing the slow dance of tectonic forces and the patient accumulation of mineral consciousness over geological time. Those who achieved this state reported encountering not the anthropomorphic gods of popular religion, but vast, slow intelligences that thought in terms of millennia and communicated through direct transmission of understanding rather than words. These encounters often resulted in prophetic insights of remarkable accuracy, but they came at a cost. Mountain walkers, who spent too much time in stone dreaming, began to exhibit physical changes that reflected their spiritual practices. Their skin would take on a gray, weathered appearance that resembled granite. Their movements became slower, more deliberate, as if they were learning to match their biological rhythms to geological time. Most mysteriously, they seemed to develop an internal compass that allowed them to navigate underground cave systems with perfect accuracy. Even in complete darkness, some mountain walkers chose to make the ultimate commitment to their practice by undertaking the Great Descent, a ritual in which they would enter a cave system within their chosen sacred mountain and never return to the surface world. Local traditions claimed that these individuals didn't die in any conventional sense, but instead became part of the mountain's consciousness, joining the geological intelligence that guided the spiritual processes occurring within the peak. Evidence for these claims comes from an unexpected source: the acoustic properties of certain caves within Greek sacred mountains. Modern speleologists have discovered that many of these cave systems possess natural acoustics that shouldn't exist given their geological formation. Sound waves introduced at certain points within the caves create complex harmonic patterns that seem to require the presence of strategically placed resonating materials that, according to analysis, consist of human bone that has been gradually replaced by mineral deposits over centuries of time. The implications are both beautiful and disturbing. If the local traditions are accurate, these caves contain the conscious remains of mountain walkers who chose to merge permanently with the mountain's awareness, their transformed bones serving as resonating elements in a vast natural instrument, designed to facilitate communication between human consciousness and geological intelligence. This interpretation gains support from historical accounts of pilgrims to these sites, reporting auditory phenomena that they described as the mountain singing. The songs were not random sounds, but complex harmonies that seemed to convey information directly to the listener's consciousness, bypassing the normal processes of hearing and comprehension. Pilgrims often reported receiving specific guidance about personal spiritual practices or warnings about future events, information that proved remarkably accurate. The tradition of mountain walking gradually faded as Greece came under Roman influence, and later as Christianity replaced the old pagan practices. But elements of the tradition survived in isolated mountain communities, preserved by families who understood their role as guardians of ancient wisdom. During the Byzantine period, some Christian hermits inadvertently rediscovered aspects of mountain walking techniques. interpreting their experiences within a Christian framework but achieving states of consciousness that closely paralleled those described by their pagan predecessors. These Christian practitioners, known as the Desert Fathers of the Heights, established monasteries on remote peaks throughout the Greek mountains, ostensibly for the purpose of contemplative prayer, but actually continuing, in modified form, the ancient tradition of direct communion with mountain consciousness. Their writings, preserved in monastery libraries, contain detailed descriptions of spiritual practices that involve extended periods of listening to the voice of the stone and learning to pray with the rhythm of the mountain's breathing. One particularly fascinating account, written by a 7th century monk named Maximos the Mountain Friend, describes a practice he called praying in geological time. This involved entering a state of consciousness in which the practitioner's awareness expanded to encompass the mountain's entire history, from its formation millions of years ago to its eventual dissolution millions of years in the future. From this perspective, Maximos wrote, human civilization appeared as a brief flicker of activity, remarkable not for its duration but for its intensity and the profound questions it posed about the nature of consciousness itself. Maximos's writings also contain references to encounters with what he called the Ancient Ones, non-human intelligences that had been present in the mountains since long before humans arrived in the region. He described them as neither physical nor purely spiritual beings, but as conscious patterns embedded in the geological structure itself, thinking beings made of stone and crystal and time. These encounters, according to Maximos, were not visions or metaphorical experiences, but actual conversations conducted through means that bypassed human language entirely. The Ancient Ones communicated by directly sharing their memories and perspectives, allowing Maximos to experience events from the mountain's distant past as if he had been present when they occurred. Through these shared memories, he learned about civilizations that had existed in the Greek mountains long before recorded history. Peoples who had developed technologies for working with stone that modern engineering cannot duplicate. The most intriguing of Maximos's accounts involves his claim to have experienced, through the memories of the Ancient Ones, the construction of the mountain's inner temples, naturally occurring cave systems that had been modified by these prehistoric peoples, using techniques that involved sympathetic resonance with the mountain's own geological processes, rather than carving or excavating. These ancient builders had learned to encourage the mountain to shape itself, guiding natural erosion and crystal formation to create sacred spaces that were simultaneously artificial and completely natural. Some of these inner temples, according to Maximos, remained accessible to those who knew how to find them, hidden behind rockfalls that were not obstacles but doorways that would open to the proper harmonic keys. He claimed to have entered several of these spaces during his years of mountain practice, discovering chambers lined with crystals that had been grown rather than placed, their formation guided by conscious intention over periods of centuries. Within these crystal chambers, Maximos encountered what he called libraries of light, repositories of knowledge that existed not as written texts, but as patterns of luminescence stored in the crystal matrices. By learning to resonate with specific crystals, he could access information about subjects ranging from healing techniques to astronomical calculations to methods of consciousness expansion that had never been written down because they could only be transmitted through direct experience. The knowledge contained in these crystal libraries, according to Maximos, was not the product of any single civilization, but represented the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of mountain practitioners, each building upon the discoveries of their predecessors. The ancient ones served as guardians and guides, helping serious seekers access the information most relevant to their spiritual development, while protecting the deeper mysteries from those who might misuse them. Maximos's accounts conclude with a warning that proved remarkably prescient. He wrote that the mountain's inner temples would eventually become inaccessible as human consciousness shifted away from direct communion with the natural world toward more abstracted forms of spirituality. The crystal libraries would not be destroyed, he claimed, but would enter a state of dormancy, waiting for a time when humans would once again learn to perceive the consciousness inherent in the earth itself. That time of dormancy began during the medieval period, as the last of the mountain walkers passed away and the Christian hermits gradually adopted more conventional forms of monastic practice. The sacred peaks of Greece became pilgrimage sites, in name only, visited by tourists and religious devotees who admired their beauty but no longer sought to commune with their consciousness. Yet the mountains themselves have not forgotten their sacred purpose. Modern climbers and hikers occasionally report experiences that echo the accounts of ancient practitioners, moments of profound stillness when time seems to slow or stop, acoustic phenomena that suggest the presence of vast chambers beneath the Earth's surface, and most commonly, an inexplicable sense that the mountain is aware of their presence and is somehow evaluating their intentions. Across the vast waters where Leif Erikson's dragon-proud ships would one day cut through Arctic waves toward a continent that already held 10,000 years of sacred mountain wisdom, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had developed relationships with peaks that made the Pradician traditions seem young and tentative by comparison. These were not mountains discovered by civilization, but mountains that had shepherded human consciousness through its earliest development. Peaks that had watched the first migrations across the Bering Land Bridge and had served as navigational guides for people's learning to read the spiritual landscape of a continent. In what would later be called Colorado, the Ute people knew the mountain they called Tava, the Sun Mountain, by a name that carried within it the recognition that certain peaks serve as focal points for cosmic energy, places where the Earth's connection to celestial forces becomes concentrated and accessible. The Spanish would rename it Blanca Peak, but the mountain itself retained its original identity, continuing to call to those who understood that landscape was not scenery but scripture, written in stone and snow and sky. The Ute mountain practices differed fundamentally from those developed in the Old World, where Greek mountain walkers sought to merge temporarily with geological consciousness. The Ute approach involved learning to recognize and work with what they called the mountain's medicine, understanding that peaks like Tava were not just sacred in themselves, but served as focal points for spiritual energy that flowed throughout the entire landscape. A mountain was not an isolated holy site, but the heart of a vast circulatory system that carried spiritual nourishment to every living thing within hundreds of miles. This understanding shaped their approach to mountain pilgrimage. Rather than climbing to reach a specific sacred location, Ute spiritual practitioners learned to trace the medicine lines that radiated outward from the mountain's base, following invisible pathways of energy that connected the peak to springs, groves, rock formations, and other natural features throughout the region. These journeys could take weeks or months, with practitioners learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when they were following a true medicine line rather than simply wandering in the wilderness. The signs were not obvious to untrained perception. A medicine line might be marked by a particular species of flower that grew only along its path, or by the presence of stones with natural holes that aligned to frame the mountain when viewed from specific points. Sometimes the lines were revealed through acoustic properties. Certain rocks along the path would produce specific tones when struck, creating a musical sequence that could be used to navigate even in darkness or heavy weather. Following a medicine line required not just physical endurance, but spiritual preparation that could take years to complete. Students learned first to recognize their own energy patterns, understanding how their personal spiritual frequency interacted with different types of natural environments. They practiced forms of moving meditation that allowed them to match their walking rhythm to the pace of energy flow along the medicine lines, discovering that proper synchronization could produce altered states of consciousness in which the landscape itself became a teacher. In these states, practitioners reported that the mountain would communicate directly with them, not through visions or voices, but through a form of knowing that bypassed sensory perception entirely. They would suddenly understand, without being told, the medicinal properties of plants they encountered, the significance of particular cloud formations, or the optimal timing for ceremonies that needed to be performed at specific locations along the medicine line. This direct transmission of knowledge was considered one of the mountain's greatest gifts, but it came with significant responsibilities. Those who received such teachings were expected to use them not for personal benefit, but for the welfare of their entire community. The mountain's medicine was understood to be inexhaustible, but not unconditional. It flowed freely to those who approached it with proper respect and intention, but it would withdraw from those who sought to exploit it for selfish purposes. The most accomplished Ute Mountain practitioners were those who learned to serve as medicine carriers, individuals who could deliberately absorb spiritual energy from the mountain and transport it to people and places that needed healing. This was not a metaphorical process, but a literal one that required specific techniques for energy storage and transmission. Medicine carriers learned to modify their own bioelectric fields to serve as containers for the mountain's healing power, carrying it within their bodies to distant locations where it could be released through ceremony. The process was physically demanding and potentially dangerous. Carrying large amounts of spiritual energy for extended periods could produce symptoms resembling altitude sickness, even at sea level. Nausea, disorientation, and a peculiar form of exhaustion that couldn't be relieved by rest. More concerning were the psychological effects. Medicine carriers often reported feeling as if they were living simultaneously in multiple dimensions, aware not just of their immediate surroundings, but of energy patterns and spiritual activities occurring throughout the entire region connected to their mountain. These experiences were not considered pathological, but represented an advanced level of spiritual development. Master medicine carriers learned to navigate multiple layers of consciousness simultaneously, maintaining their effectiveness in ordinary reality, while also serving as conscious participants in the spiritual processes that maintained the health of the entire ecosystem. They became, in effect, human extensions of the mountain's consciousness, serving as its agents in the human world. The role required not just spiritual training, but extensive knowledge of what might be called energy ecology, understanding how spiritual forces moved through the landscape and how human activities could either support or disrupt these natural flows. Medicine carriers served as early warning systems for spiritual pollution, detecting subtle changes in the mountain's energy patterns that might indicate problems developing elsewhere in the region. Some of these disruptions were natural: drought, cycles, disease outbreaks, or migrations of animal populations that altered the region's spiritual balance. But increasingly, especially after European contact, the disruptions were human-caused, mining operations that literally cut through medicine lines, dam construction that interrupted the flow of spiritual energy along waterways, or the establishment of settlements in locations that served as crucial nodes in the landscape's energy network. The medicine carriers, reports of these disruptions, transmitted through traditional communication networks that connected tribes across vast distances, created one of the earliest continental-scale environmental monitoring systems. Information about changes in mountain energy patterns could travel from the Colorado Rockies to the Great Lakes or from the Appalachians to the Gulf Coast, allowing indigenous communities to prepare for ecological changes long before they became visible through conventional observation. This network also facilitated the sharing of mountain-based spiritual technologies. Techniques developed by Ute practitioners working with Tava could be adapted by Cherokee medicine people working with the peaks of the Appalachians, or by Lakota spiritual leaders learning to commune with the Black Hills. Each mountain had its own personality and preferred methods of interaction, but the fundamental principles of mountain consciousness were universal enough to allow for cross-cultural exchange and mutual learning. The Cherokee relationship with their sacred mountains demonstrated a different but complementary approach to peak consciousness. Where the Ute focused on medicine lines and energy transmission, the Cherokee developed sophisticated methods for what they called mountain dreaming techniques, for accessing the prophetic and visionary capabilities that certain peaks possessed in abundance. The Cherokee understood that mountains, by virtue of their position between earth and sky, served as natural antennae for receiving information from both terrestrial and celestial sources. A mountain's height allowed it to detect subtle changes in weather patterns, animal migrations, and other natural phenomena long before these changes became apparent at ground level. But mountains also served as receivers for what the Cherokee called sky messages, information that came from beyond the earth entirely, communications from star people and other cosmic intelligences that used mountain peaks as relay stations. For their transmissions, Cherokee mountain dreaming involved learning to synchronize human consciousness with the mountain's role as a cosmic antenna, effectively using the peak's enhanced perceptual capabilities to expand one's own awareness beyond normal human limitations. Practitioners would spend extended periods at specific locations on sacred mountains, locations that had been identified through generations of experimentation as optimal points for receiving sky messages. These locations were not necessarily the highest points on the mountain, but were determined by more subtle factors: the presence of specific mineral deposits that enhanced psychic reception, the alignment of rock formations that created natural focusing effects, or the intersection of underground water flows that generated electromagnetic phenomena conducive to expanded consciousness. The mountain dreaming process began with several days of preparation, during which practitioners would fast, purify themselves through sweating and herbal treatments, and gradually shift their sleep cycles to match the mountain's own rhythms. Mountains, according to Cherokee understanding, had their own periods of wakefulness and rest that followed cycles longer than human ones, and successful mountain dreaming required synchronizing with these natural rhythms. Once properly prepared, practitioners would enter a state that was neither ordinary sleeping nor waking consciousness, but something between the two, a condition they called stone sleeping. In this state, their awareness could merge temporarily with a mountain's perceptual field, experiencing the world from the perspective of a consciousness that existed on geological rather than biological timescales. From this expanded perspective, Practitioners could access information about future events, but not in the linear fashion of conventional prophecy. Instead, they experienced what the Cherokee called mountain time, a form of consciousness in which past, present, and future existed simultaneously and could be observed as a single, complex pattern. Events that hadn't yet occurred in human time could be seen as natural outgrowths of forces already in motion, while events from the distant past remained actively present, continuing to influence contemporary circumstances in ways that ordinary perception couldn't detect. Mountain dreamers trained for decades to learn how to navigate this non-linear form of consciousness and translate their experiences into guidance that would be useful for their communities. The most skilled practitioners could access information about weather patterns years in advance, predict the optimal timing for hunting and gathering activities, and provide warnings about potential conflicts with neighboring peoples. But the most valued mountain dreaming involved accessing what the Cherokee called the Great Pattern, the overall trajectory of human spiritual development, and the role that indigenous peoples were destined to play in the Earth's evolutionary process. These visions often depicted future times when the wisdom preserved in sacred mountains would become crucial for humanity's survival. Periods when the technologies and understandings developed through millennia of mountain practice would be needed to heal the damage caused by civilizations that had lost their connection to the natural world. The accuracy of these prophetic visions became tragically apparent during the period of European colonization. Cherokee mountain dreamers had foreseen the coming of peoples from across the ocean, who would bring devastating diseases and technologies that could destroy the natural balance in ways that had never before been possible. They had tried to prepare their communities for these challenges, but the scope of the disruption exceeded even their expanded perception. Many sacred sites were destroyed or desecrated during this period, but the mountains themselves proved remarkably resilient. Their consciousness retreated deeper into the geological structure, becoming less accessible to casual seekers, but maintaining their essential function as repositories of ancient wisdom. The mountain dreaming tradition survived in altered form, passed down through families who understood that the knowledge would be needed again when humanity was ready to remember its proper relationship with the earth today. As environmental crises force a reconsideration of indigenous wisdom, some Cherokee practitioners are beginning to re-establish contact with their sacred mountains, finding that the peaks have indeed preserved the ancient teachings and are ready to share them with those who approach with proper respect and understanding. The mountains remember everything, they say, and they are patient teachers for those willing to learn at geological speed. This patience becomes evident to anyone who spends extended time in proximity to these ancient peaks, learning to feel the slow pulse of their geological consciousness and beginning to understand that human civilization, for all its apparent permanence, is just one brief experiment in the mountain's ongoing exploration of what consciousness can become when it embodies itself in stone and ice and the patient accumulation of millennia. The shamans of the Altai knew the secret corridors that wound through Belukha's heart, passages carved not by water or wind, but by something far older. They spoke in hushed reverence of the mountain's inner chambers, where crystalline formations caught and held the whispers of those who had climbed these slopes before the first empires rose from dust. Each crystal, they believed, contained a fragment of ancient wisdom, a syllable in an endless prayer that had been echoing through the mountain's core since the world was young. In the pre-dawn darkness, when the boundary between dream and waking dissolved like mist, the shamans would begin their ascent. They carried with them small offerings, carved bone, dried herbs, fragments of meteorite that had fallen from the same stars their ancestors once navigated by. These gifts were not for the mountain itself, but for the presences they believed dwelt within its stone chambers, ancient guardians who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. Like fleeting seasons, the ascent was never undertaken alone. Even when a shaman climbed in solitude, they understood themselves to be accompanied by an invisible procession, the spirits of every holy person who had ever sought the mountain's secrets. Their footsteps joined a rhythm that had been maintained for millennia, a sacred cadence that kept the mountain's power flowing through the world below. To break this rhythm, to climb with haste or without proper reverence, was to risk awakening forces that had slumbered since the earth's childhood. As they climbed higher, passing through forests where the trees grew in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, the shamans would pause at specific stones markers placed by their predecessors generations before. Each stone bore subtle scratches, symbols that could not be deciphered by untrained eyes, but spoke volumes to those initiated in the mountain's mysteries. These markers formed a kind of vertical text, a message written across the mountain's face that told the story of humanity's relationship with the sacred peak. The symbols were not static. Weathering had changed them over centuries, and the shaman understood this erosion as part of the mountain's own communication. What the wind and ice chose to preserve or obliterate carried meaning. A symbol half erased might indicate that certain knowledge was meant to fade, while markings that remained sharp despite decades of exposure were considered especially significant, worthy of deeper meditation. High above the tree line, where oxygen grew thin and thoughts seemed to crystallize in the cold air, the shamans entered what they called the breathing zone. Here, the mountain revealed its living nature most clearly. Crevices in the rock face would exhale warm, herb-scented air, even in the depths of winter, while other openings drew breath inward with a suction that could be felt against the skin. These respiratory patterns followed cycles that aligned with celestial movements. The mountain's breathing deepened during new moons, quickened at the equinoxes, and fell to its slowest rhythm during the winter solstice. The shamans mapped these breathing points across generations, creating mental charts more detailed than any physical survey. They knew which exhalations carried prophetic dreams, which inhalations could draw sickness from the body, and which breath cycles were too powerful for human contact. Some openings were sealed with carefully placed stones, not to block the mountain's breathing, but to redirect it along safer channels. These seals required constant maintenance, and part of every sacred journey involved checking and adjusting them as needed. The breath that emerged from these openings carried more than air. Shamans spoke of inhaling memories, sudden flashes of scenes from centuries past, images of pilgrims who had stood in these same spots, visions of the mountain before human feet had ever touched its slopes. Some breaths brought knowledge, understanding of herb combinations, insights into weather patterns, or awareness of distant events affecting their communities below. The most potent exhalations carried what they called stone dreams, visions, so vivid and transformative that shamans would sometimes spend years interpreting their meanings. But the mountain's breath could also be dangerous. Certain openings exhaled confusion, causing climbers to lose their way even on familiar paths. Others brought despair, filling the mind with images of failure and loss. The shamans learned to recognize these malevolent breaths by their temperature and scent, teaching their apprentices to identify and avoid them. They understood that the mountain was not uniformly benevolent like any living being. It had moods, ailments, and areas of disturbance that required careful navigation. The relationship between shaman and mountain was thus one of constant negotiation. Each ascent began with prayers of introduction, acknowledging both the climber's intentions and the mountain's sovereignty. The shamans would burn specific incenses at designated altitudes, sending smoke signals that announced their presence and peaceful purpose. They understood that uninvited intrusion into the mountain's sacred spaces could result in avalanches, sudden storms, or the kind of profound disorientation that left climbers wandering in circles until exhaustion claimed them as they approached the highest accessible slopes, where the air grew too thin for sustained human presence. The shamans would enter their deepest trance states. Here, supported by breathing techniques passed down through generations, they communed directly with what they believed was the mountain's consciousness. These conversations took place not in words, but in exchanges of sensation, emotion, and imagery. The mountain would share glimpses of its geological memories, the pressures that had shaped its formation, the ice ages that had carved its valleys, the cosmic events that had showered it with meteoric minerals. In return, the shamans offered their own memories, the stories of their people, the changes they had witnessed in the world below, their hopes and fears for the future. This exchange created a living archive, a repository of both geological and human history that existed in the liminal space between rock and consciousness. The shamans understood themselves as librarians of this archive, responsible for maintaining the connection between human and geological memory. The descent from these heights required as much ritual care as the ascent. The shamans would carry small stones from the upper reaches, but only those that seemed to offer themselves rocks that had been loosened by natural processes rather than forcibly removed. These stones became focal points for meditation throughout the following year, each one holding specific energies and memories from the mountain's heart. They were never kept permanently. At the end of their usefulness, they were returned to the mountain during subsequent climbs, creating a cycle of exchange that honored the peak's living nature. Thousands of miles from the Altai peaks, another sacred mountain drew pilgrims along paths worn smooth by countless feet over countless centuries. Mount Kailash, rising from the Tibetan plateau like a perfectly sculpted pyramid of black rock crowned with eternal snow, had been calling to the faithful long before the great religions claimed it as their own. Here, the pilgrimage was not vertical, but circular, a ritual circumambulation that traced a path around the mountain's base. Each step measured not in distance, but in devotion. The ancient-born practitioners who first walked these paths understood the mountain as the axis around which all existence revolved. To them, Kailash was not merely sacred, it was the very center of the spiritual universe, the point where heaven and earth touched, where the ordinary laws of physics bent beneath the weight of pure sanctity. Their circumambulation, performed always in a clockwise direction, was a way of aligning human movement with the cosmic order, of joining the eternal dance that kept the universe in balance. Each step of the Kora, as the pilgrimage circuit came to be known, carried specific significance. The path wound through landscapes that shifted like pages in a sacred text, from barren rocky plains where the wind carried prayers across vast distances, to valley floors where hidden springs provided water that pilgrims believed could wash away lifetimes of accumulated karma. The contrast between desolation and sudden fertility was understood as a teaching about the nature of spiritual life, that enlightenment could bloom even in the harshest conditions, that the divine often revealed itself precisely where it seemed most absent. The pilgrims who walked this path came, bearing stories from every corner of the known world. Hindu ascetics spoke of Kailash as the dwelling place of Shiva. where the great god sat in eternal meditation, his consciousness so expanded that it encompassed all of creation. Buddhist monks described it as the earthly manifestation of Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the center of all Buddhist cosmology. Jain pilgrims venerated it as the site where their first Tirthankara achieved liberation. Each tradition brought its own understanding, yet all recognized the mountain's fundamental mystery, its capacity to mean everything to everyone while remaining essentially itself, unchanged and unchanging. The physical demands of the pilgrimage were severe at an altitude where every breath required conscious effort. Pilgrims walked for days through terrain that offered little shelter from sun, wind, or sudden storms. Many prostrated themselves for the entire circuit, measuring the 52 kilometers with their bodies, pressing forehead to ground and then stretching forward to place hands where their head had touched, rising and repeating the process thousands upon thousands of times. This full-body pilgrimage could take weeks to complete, each prostration an act of surrender that gradually dissolved the boundaries between self and mountain, pilgrim and path. Those who walked the circuit multiple times, many pilgrims returned, year after year, sometimes completing the circle dozens of times over their lifetimes, spoke of how the mountain revealed different aspects of itself with each circumambulation. The first walk might be dominated by physical challenge and simple wonder at the landscape's austere beauty. Subsequent journeys revealed subtler layers, the way morning light struck certain rock formations at particular seasons, the patterns of cloud formation around the peak, the locations where other pilgrims had left offerings or where significant spiritual experiences had occurred. The most dedicated pilgrims developed an intimate knowledge of every stone along the path. They could walk the circuit in darkness, guided by the feel of the ground beneath their feet and the sound of wind patterns around familiar outcroppings. They knew which sections of the path would be muddy after rain, where snow lingered longest, which viewpoints offered the clearest perspectives of the mountains for faces. This knowledge was more than practical, it was a form of communion, a way of knowing the mountain not as an object to be observed, but as a living presence to be engaged with directly. The offerings left along the path created a constantly changing gallery of devotion. Prayer flags fluttered from every available anchor point, their colors fading from bright primaries to pale pastels as weather and time worked their transformation. Stones were stacked into cairns that served both as trail markers and as repositories. For pilgrims' prayers, each stone placed with intention, each stack a community effort spanning years or decades. Butter lamps flickered in sheltered alcoves, their flames somehow persisting despite high-altitude winds. Kotta scarves, blessed by high lamas, were tied to rocks and bushes, creating a textile map of devotion that marked the most significant points along the route. The path itself became a teacher. Its challenges were not obstacles to be overcome, but lessons to be absorbed. The steep ascent to Dormala, the circuit's highest point at over 5,000 meters, left pilgrims gasping and forced them to confront their physical limitations. The long, seemingly endless stretches across barren plateaus taught patience and perseverance. Rocky sections that required careful navigation demanded mindfulness and presence. Each challenge was understood as a mirror, reflecting back the pilgrims' spiritual state and offering opportunities for growth, where the conditions added another layer of teaching. Sudden storms could arise from clear skies, trapping pilgrims in their tracks and forcing them to seek shelter among the rocks. These delays were rarely seen as inconveniences, but rather as opportunities for deeper practice moments when the mountain demanded stillness, reflection, or the cultivation of acceptance. Pilgrims told stories of being stranded for days in severe weather, only to emerge with profound insights that they credited to the mountains teaching through hardship. The community that formed among pilgrims was itself part of the mountains. Sacred ecology. Strangers became companions, sharing food, water, and shelter without question. Language barriers dissolved in the face of common purpose and mutual vulnerability. Tibetan nomads would appear, seemingly from nowhere, to offer assistance. Two struggling pilgrims, their faces weathered by high-altitude sun but their eyes bright with the joy of service. These encounters were understood as expressions of the mountain's compassion, its way of providing what was needed precisely when it was needed most. In the shadow of Japan's sacred Mount Fuji, a different kind of mountain worship evolved that elevated aesthetic appreciation to the level of spiritual practice. The Yamabushi, mountain ascetics, who had wandered Japan's peaks for over 1,000 years, developed practices that transformed the simple act of viewing the mountain into profound meditation. They understood that Fuji's perfect cone shape was not merely beautiful but spiritually instructive, a natural mandala that taught lessons about balance, proportion, and the relationship between earth and sky. The Yamabushi tradition emerged from the marriage of indigenous Shinto beliefs with Buddhist philosophy and Taoist practices imported from China. These mountain wanderers, dressed in white robes and carrying conch shells that announced their presence across valleys, saw no distinction between religious practice and mountain climbing. For them, every peak was a temple, every forest path, a pilgrimage route, every natural phenomenon a teaching from the Kamiha divine spirits that animated all things. Their relationship with Fuji was particularly complex, shaped by the mountain's dual nature as both sacred object and active volcano. The Yamabushi understood volcanic activity, not as geological accident, but as divine expression, the mountain's way of communicating its continued vitality and power. They developed elaborate rituals for approaching the mountain during different phases of its activity, understanding that the spiritual energy available for cultivation varied with the geological state of the peak. When Fuji was dormant, as it had been for centuries, the Yamabushi treated it as a sleeping deity approaching, with the quiet reverence appropriate for entering a temple where services were not currently in session. They climbed its slopes during specific seasons, following routes that had been established through generations of experience and revelation. Each major landmark along these paths are 10 rock formations, forest clearings, viewpoints, as stations for specific practices, breathing exercises, chanted prayers, periods of silent meditation. The ascetic practices performed on Fuji's slopes were designed to harmonize human consciousness with what the Yamabushi saw as the mountain's essential nature. Perfect balance between opposing forces, fire and ice, coexisted in the peaks, structure molten rock beneath permanent snow, creative and destructive energies held in eternal tension. The mountain's nearly perfect symmetry was understood as a lesson in the unity of opposites, a three-dimensional teaching about the nature of existence itself. Pilgrims who climbed with the Yamabushi learned to see the mountain's changing appearance throughout the day as a kind of visual Dharma teaching. Dawn revealed Fuji as a black silhouette against the lightning sky, a reminder of the mystery that underlies all apparent phenomena. As sunrise progressed, the peak's eastern face caught fire with alpenglow, demonstrating the transformative power of illumination. Midday brought clear views of geological details, the texture of ancient lava flows, the patterns of erosion, the sharp definition of the crater rimming Kurjin, contemplation of impermanence and the constant process of creation and destruction that shapes all existence. Evening brought perhaps the most sacred moments, when the mountain's western face glowed with reflected sunset light, while its eastern slopes fell into deep purple shadow. This daily demonstration of light and darkness, revelation and concealment, was understood as a teaching about the nature of enlightenment itself, how understanding comes and goes, how spiritual insight must be cultivated repeatedly rather than achieved once and held forever. The seasonal changes in Fuji's appearance provided another layer of instruction. Spring brought cherry blossoms to the lower slopes, their brief flowering understood as a meditation on beauty and transience. Summer revealed the mountain's full geological complexity as snow retreated to expose the varied textures and colors of different lava flows. Autumn surrounded the peak with maple fire, creating a natural mandala of color that demonstrated the beauty inherent in processes of transformation and letting go. Winter wrapped Fuji in snow that was both beautiful and forbidding, teaching about the austere depths of spiritual practice. The Yamabushi developed sophisticated methods for reading weather patterns around the mountain, understanding these not merely as meteorological phenomena but as expressions of divine mood and intention. Certain cloud formations around Fuji's peak were considered especially auspicious for spiritual practice, while others warned of internal turmoil that made the mountain unsuitable for ascent. The direction and intensity of winds around the peak were interpreted as indicators of the mountain's receptivity to human presence. These weather-reading skills became part of a larger system of mountain communication that the Yamabushi developed over centuries. They learned to interpret the sounds the mountain made, the settling of rocks in temperature changes, the movement of ice in hidden crevices, the resonance of wind through particular formations. Each sound was understood to carry information about the mountain's current state and its relationship to cosmic forces beyond immediate perception. The practice of mountain listening required years to develop. Novice Yamabushi would spend seasons simply sitting in designated locations, training their ears to distinguish between different types of mountain sounds and their significance. They learned to identify the subtle acoustic changes that preceded weather shifts, the particular quality of silence that indicated approaching seismic activity, the difference between sounds that emerged from the mountain itself and those that were merely echoes of human activity below. This acoustic relationship with the mountain was complemented by equally sophisticated visual practices. The Yamabushi developed forms of meditation based on sustained observation of the mountain's appearance, training themselves to notice minute changes in color, shadow, and atmospheric effects that escaped casual observation. They could detect subtle shifts in the mountain's visual presence that preceded major weather changes, identify optimal conditions for different types of spiritual practice, and recognize visual signs that indicated the mountain's receptivity to human approach. Advanced practitioners developed what they called mountain sight, a way of seeing that penetrated beyond the mountain's surface appearance to perceive its underlying spiritual anatomy. They spoke of being able to see the flow of energy through the mountain's structure, to perceive the connections between different parts of the peak and between the mountain and surrounding landscape. This ability required not only training but also a fundamental shift in consciousness, a way of perceiving that treated the mountain not as an object to be looked at, but as a subject to be communed with. Far from Fuji's graceful isolation, the Himalayas rose like a frozen wave across the spine of Asia, holding within their ice-locked valleys secrets that predated human memory. Here, among peaks that scraped the edge of breathable atmosphere, The relationship between sacred and mountain took on dimensions that challenged the very boundaries of human understanding. The high valleys, accessible only during brief summer, seasons when ancient glaciers retreated enough to reveal hidden passes, contained temples and monasteries that seemed to exist in a realm between earth and sky. These high-altitude sanctuaries were more than mere buildings constructed at extreme elevation. They were carefully positioned, nodes in a vast network of spiritual energy that the region's inhabitants believed flowed through the mountain, ranges like water through hidden channels. The placement of each monastery, each chorten, each prayer flag had been determined, not by convenience or accessibility, but by the perceived intersection of these invisible currents. Monks spoke of feeling the energy lines like underground rivers, following their flow across seemingly impossible terrain to locate the precise spots where temples should be built. The architecture of these high-altitude sanctuaries reflected their unique position between worlds. Walls were built thick enough to withstand not only the physical extremes of wind and cold, but also what monks described as spiritual pressures, forces that pressed against human consciousness at such altitudes, challenging the mind's ability to maintain coherent thought. Windows were positioned to frame specific mountain peaks at certain times of day, creating living mandalas that changed with the movement of light and shadow across distant summits. The daily rhythms of life in these elevated sanctuaries followed patterns dictated by the mountains themselves rather than conventional human schedules. Prayers began before dawn, not from tradition alone, but because the pre-dawn hours brought what monks described as the clearest spiritual reception, moments when the thin air and deep silence created optimal conditions for communion with the divine presences they believed inhabited the highest peaks. The quality of silence at such altitudes was unlike anything experienced at lower elevations, so complete and profound that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing against consciousness in ways that either expanded awareness dramatically or induced profound disorientation. This altitude-induced expansion of consciousness was both sought after and carefully managed. Monks developed elaborate practices for navigating what they called thinner mind, the altered states of consciousness that naturally arose when human awareness was pressed to function in conditions where every breath required conscious effort. They learned to distinguish between insights that emerged from genuine spiritual opening and hallucinations induced by oxygen deprivation, developing tests and verification methods that could be applied even when ordinary rational thinking was compromised by altitude. The seasonal isolation of these high sanctuaries created unique challenges and opportunities for spiritual practice. During winter months, when snow blocked all access routes and the monasteries became completely cut off from the outside world, monks entered periods of intensive retreat that could last for months. These forced isolations were understood not as hardships to be endured, but as precious opportunities for the kind of deep spiritual work that required complete separation from worldly concerns. Food stores for these winter retreats had to be planned months in advance, but the monks had learned to see even the constraints of limited provisions as spiritual teachings. The gradual reduction of food variety and quantity throughout the winter months was understood as a natural form of fasting practice, a way of letting go of physical attachments that paralleled the letting go of mental attachments that was the goal of their meditation. By spring, when the first supply caravans could again reach the high valleys, the monks often reported that their reduced physical needs had been more than compensated by increased spiritual vitality. The arrival of spring brought not only physical relief, but also profound spiritual significance. The sound of melting ice, absent for months, returned like a symphony of liberation. The first flowers to bloom in the harsh high-altitude conditions were greeted like visiting deities. Their ability to manifest beauty in such extreme conditions, understood as teachings about the nature of enlightenment itself, how wisdom could bloom even in the most challenging circumstances. But perhaps most significant was the spring revelation of the mountains themselves. As weather cleared to reveal peaks that had been hidden behind winter clouds for months, monks spoke of these moments of revelation as spiritual experiences comparable to the most profound meditation insights suttan, overwhelming encounters with beauty and majesty that temporarily dissolved all sense of separation between observer and observed. The mountains seemed to emerge from winter, not merely revealed but transformed, as if their months of hiddenness had allowed them to renew their essential nature. The specific mountains, visible from each monastery, were understood to serve as focal points for different types of spiritual practice. Certain peaks were associated with compassion, cultivation, their shapes, and the quality of light they received throughout the day, believed to support meditations on loving kindness. Others were connected with wisdom practices, their stark, austere profiles teaching lessons about the nature of reality beyond superficial appearances. Still others were linked to practices of surrender and letting go, their towering, overwhelming presence serving as reminders of forces far greater than individual will or understanding. The monks developed elaborate systems for correlating their meditation practices with the changing appearance of these mountain teachers throughout the day and seasons. Dawn meditation might focus on peaks to the east, their surfaces catching the first light and demonstrating the awakening of awareness. Midday practices might turn to southern exposures, where full sunlight revealed the complete geological complexity of their mountain instructors. Evening meditations followed the light to western faces, contemplating impermanence and the daily practice of letting go. That sunset represented. Night brought another dimension to mountain-based spiritual practice. At high altitude, with air so clear that stars seemed close enough to touch, the mountains became silhouettes against the cosmic backdrop. Their familiar daytime personalities dissolved into mysterious presences that spoke of forces and timescales beyond human comprehension. Monks practiced forms of meditation that used these nighttime mountain profiles as gateways to contemplation of emptiness, the fundamental lack of inherent existence that Buddhist philosophy identified as the ultimate nature of all phenomena. The relationship between monastery and mountain was understood to be reciprocal. Just as the peaks served as teachers and focal points for human spiritual development, the human practices performed in their presence were believed to serve the mountains' own spiritual function. The chanted prayers, the meditation sessions, the daily rounds of ritual activity were understood to contribute to the maintenance of cosmic harmony, helping to keep the spiritual energies of the mountain ranges flowing properly through the world. Sense of mutual service extended to practical care for the mountain environment. Monasteries developed elaborate protocols for minimizing their impact on the fragile high-altitude ecosystems that surrounded them. Water was used with ceremonial care, understanding that in such environments every drop was precious, not only practically but spiritually. Waste was managed with meticulous attention, recognizing that pollution at such altitudes could disrupt spiritual as well as ecological balance. The gathering of medicinal plants from high-altitude slopes was performed with ritual precision, each harvest understood as a negotiation between human need and mountain generosity. Certain plants were gathered only at specific times, when astronomical conditions were believed to maximize their healing properties. Others were harvested according to lunar cycles, or in response to particular weather patterns that indicated the mountain's readiness to share its botanical treasures. Death at high altitude held special significance in these mountain monasteries. The thin air and extreme conditions meant that the dying process often unfolded differently than at lower elevations, with consciousness sometimes expanding dramatically in the hours before death. Monks developed specialized practices for guiding the dying through these altitude-enhanced transitions, understanding that the mountain environment itself could serve as a support for the consciousness leaving the body. The bodies of those who died in the high sanctuaries were often disposed of through sky burial practices adapted to the mountain environment. The extreme cold and intense solar radiation at altitude meant that natural decomposition followed different patterns than at lower elevations, and the monks learned to work with these conditions rather than against them. The mountains themselves were understood to participate in these death rites, the harsh conditions, serving not as obstacles to proper burial but as active participants in the transformation of human remains back into the elements from which they had emerged. The silence that followed was not the gentle hush of contemplation that had blessed these peaks for millennia. It was the silence of absence, of breath held too long, of words spoken into emptiness. In the valleys below, Machu Picchu, where the Urubamba River carved its ancient path through stone and memory, the last of the Inca's children had vanished into the mist like smoke from dying embers. The terraces stood empty, their precise stonework still defying gravity and time. But the hands that had shaped them were dust, and the voices that had sung their morning prayers to Inti had been swallowed by a silence that would stretch across centuries. The Spanish had come with their hunger for gold and their certainty of righteousness. But they had found something that troubled them more than they could name. The mountains themselves seemed to watch, seemed to wait, seemed to remember things that made the conquistadors' dreams uneasy. They tore down the Temple of the Sun in Cusco, but they could not tear down the presence that lingered in the peaks. Above, they melted the golden plates that had caught the first light of dawn, but they could not melt the knowledge that dwelt in the stones themselves. Huayna Capac, the last great emperor, had felt it coming like a shadow across his dreams. The bearded strangers from across the great water, the diseases that would hollow out his people like fire through dry grass, the ending of the world as his ancestors had known it. He had seen it in the flights of the condors, in the way the mountain spirits seemed to turn their faces away, in the unseasonable storms that lashed the peaks with a fury that spoke of cosmic imbalance. But the collapse was not sudden, despite the swiftness of Spanish steel. The Inca had built their empire on foundations older than their own memory, on the knowledge of peoples who had shaped the mountains long before the first Inca had claimed the title of Son of the Sun. The Chavin, the Wari, the Tiwanakuit had left their mark on the sacred geography. Each had added their voice to the chorus of stone and wind that sang the old songs of the peaks. As the Spanish settled into their new dominion, they began to notice things that their priests could not explain. The natives continued to leave offerings at certain stones, continued to whisper prayers in languages that predated the Inca themselves. The mountains seemed to have a memory that ran deeper than conquest, deeper than empire, deeper than the names that humans had given to their peaks and valleys. In the Himalayas, time moved differently. The British came with their theodolites and their certainty, mapping peaks and naming them for their queens and generals. But the mountains absorbed these new appellations like water into stone. neither accepting nor rejecting them. The local peoples continued to know the peaks by their older names, the names that spoke of the deities who dwelt there, the spirits who controlled the snows and the winds. The Sherpas watched the Sahiblog with the same patient attention they had given to all the strangers who had come to their valleys over the centuries. Tibetans, Mongolians, Chinese each had brought their own understanding of the sacred, their own interpretation of the relationship between human and divine. But the mountains remained unchanged, their snow-crowned heads still catching the first light of dawn, still sending their glacial tears down to feed the rivers that sustained half the world. Yet something was changing, something subtle but profound. The old ways of reading the mountains were being forgotten or pushed aside by the urgency of survival in a world that seemed to value only what could be counted, weighed, and sold. The meditation caves, where lamas had once spent years in contemplation, began to empty. The prayer flags that had carried the hopes of countless generations still fluttered in the wind, but fewer hands were there to replace them when the mountain weather tore them to tatters. Pemba, the last of the great mountain oracles, had seen it in his dreams long before the first European boot had left its mark in Himalayan snow. He had seen the time when the peaks would be conquered, not by armies, but by something more insidious, by the forgetting of what they truly were. The mountains would become challenges to be overcome, summits to be claimed, photographs to be taken. Their voices would be drowned out by the roar of helicopter blades and the chatter of radio transmissions. But even as the old ways faded, something persisted. The mountains themselves seemed to hold the memory of what they had been, what they had witnessed, what they had inspired in the hearts of those who had approached them with reverence rather than conquest. In the deepest valleys, where the modern world had not yet penetrated, the old prayers still echoed. In the highest passes, where the air was too thin for most human activity, the presence of the sacred remained as strong as ever. On Olympus, the silence was different from the silence that had fallen over the Andes, or the growing quiet of the Himalayas. Here, the silence was the silence of gods who had departed, leaving behind only the memory of their presence carved in marble and sung in verses that fewer and fewer voices could remember. The oracle at Delphi had spoken her last prophecy, her voice fading like smoke from the sacred fissures that had once breathed the breath of Apollo himself. Theodosius had issued his edicts, but the true death of the old gods had not come with imperial proclamation. It had come with the gradual fading of belief, the slow turning of hearts toward new deities, new hopes, new fears. The temples had been abandoned not by force but by neglect, their priests dying without successors, their rituals forgotten in the rush toward salvation that promised more than the ancient gods had ever offered. Yet the mountain remembered, in the caves where the mysteries had been celebrated, in the groves where the nymphs had danced, in the springs where the waters had been blessed by divine touch, something lingered. The peasants who tended their goats on the mountainside still crossed themselves when they passed certain stones, still left small offerings at springs that bubbled with water that had been sacred for longer than memory could reach. The Byzantines had tried to Christianize the mountain, building churches on the sites of ancient temples, but the stones themselves seemed to resist the transformation. The churches crumbled while the ancient foundations remained. The crosses weathered away while the older symbols, cut deep into stone, endured. The mountain had absorbed too much divine presence to be easily cleansed of it in the medieval period. Pilgrims came seeking the Christian hermits who had made their homes in the caves of Olympus, but they found something more than they had expected. The hermits themselves spoke of dreams that seemed to come from deeper sources than their own piety, of visions that included figures that would have been familiar to the ancient Greeks, who had first called this mountain home to the gods, brother. Maximos, the last of the great Olympian hermits, had spent 40 years in a cave that had once been sacred to Demeter. He had come seeking solitude and divine communion, but he had found something else entirely. The mountain had taught him that the divine did not abandon its chosen places lightly, that the presence of the sacred could outlast the names that humans gave to it, could outlast the rituals that had once honored it. The collapse of the sacred was not always violent. Sometimes it was as gentle as the settling of dust after a great wind had passed. In Japan, where the kami had dwelt in the mountains since the time before time, the arrival of Buddhism had not destroyed the older understanding, but had layered new meaning over the ancient truths. The mountains remained sacred, but their sacredness was expressed in new ways, understood through new frameworks. Mount Fuji watched as the world changed around it. The samurai who had once climbed its slopes seeking purification gave way to merchants who climbed seeking fortune, who gave way to pilgrims who climbed seeking enlightenment, who gave way to tourists who climbed seeking photographs. Each generation brought its own understanding of what the mountain meant, but the mountain itself remained constant, its snow-capped peak still serving as a beacon for those who sought something beyond the merely human. The Meiji Restoration had brought new ideas about the relationship between the human and the divine, new ways of understanding the role of the sacred in national identity. But even as the government sought to systematize and control the religious impulses of the people, the mountains continued to call to those who were willing to listen. The Yamabushi, the mountain ascetics, continued their practices in secret, preserving the old ways of reading the language of stone and wind. Master Kobo, the last of the great Yamabushi teachers, had felt the change like a shift in the wind that preceded a storm. The young men who came to him for training were different from those who had come before. They brought with them the urgency of the modern world, the need to achieve quickly what their predecessors had been content to pursue over lifetimes. They wanted to master the mountains rather than be mastered by them. But the mountains were patient. They had taught the same lessons for millennia, and they would continue to teach them to those who were willing to learn. The snow would fall and melt, the seasons would turn, the volcanic fire would sleep and wake according to rhythms that had nothing to do with human ambition or human understanding of time. In the Australian interior, where the Dreamtime had shaped the landscape before, the first human footprint had marked the red earth. The collapse came not with conquest, but with displacement. The sacred sites that had been tended for 40,000 years were suddenly empty, their traditional guardians scattered to missions and settlements, their songs interrupted by the noise of progress. But the mountains remembered. Uluru still caught the light at dawn and dusk, still glowed with the fire that had burned in the hearts of the Anangu people since the beginning of time. The spirits that dwelt in the rock were not diminished by the absence of their human interpreters. They waited, as they had always waited, for the time when the songs would be sung again, when the stories would be told, when the ancient relationship between human and sacred would be renewed. The last of the traditional elders had felt the breaking like a physical pain. The young people were being taken away to learn new ways, to forget the old language, to become something other than what they had been. But even as they were forced to abandon their traditional practices, they carried within them the memory of the mountains, the knowledge of the sacred that had been passed down through countless generations. Inganyanerpa, the last keeper of the Uluru stories, had seen it in her dreams before it happened. She had seen the time when strangers would come and fence off the sacred places, when the ancient tracks would be forgotten, when the songs that had maintained the balance of the world would fall silent. But she had also seen something else, a time when the mountains would call their children home, when the old knowledge would be remembered, when the sacred would reassert itself in ways that the modern world could not ignore. The mountains of the Aboriginal Dreamtime were different from the mountains that other peoples had known. They were not separate from the land around them, but part of a continuous sacred geography that connected all things. The spirits that dwelt in them were not distant deities, but intimate relations, ancestors who had shaped the land and continued to shape it through their presence. Even as the traditional culture was forced underground, the mountains continued to exert their influence. The settlers who came to the interior found that the land itself seemed to resist their efforts to impose European notions of agriculture and settlement. The Red Earth had its own rules, its own rhythms, its own way of dealing with those who did not understand its nature. Across the world, in the volcanic peaks of the Pacific Ring of Fire, similar stories were being played out. The Maori of New Zealand had known their mountains as ancestors, had understood them as living beings, with their own spiritual essence. The arrival of European colonizers had disrupted this understanding, but it had not destroyed it. The mountains themselves continued to assert their presence, continued to demand recognition of their sacred nature. Mount Taranaki stood solitary on the North Island, its perfect cone a reminder of the power that slept beneath the earth. The Maori had known the mountain as a jealous lover, exiled from his beloved peaks by the other volcano gods. The early Europeans had seen only a mountain, a geographical feature to be named and mapped and eventually conquered. But the mountain had its own agenda, its own way of dealing with those who approached it without proper respect. The last of the traditional Tohunga, the Maori priests who had maintained the proper relationship with the mountains, had felt the change like a wound in the earth itself. The young people were being taught new ways, new gods, new understandings of the relationship between human and divine. But the mountains were patient. They had waited through the ice ages, through the volcanic upheavals that had shaped the islands, through the arrival of the first Polynesian voyagers. They could wait a little longer in the Philippines, where the rice terraces had climbed the mountainsides for 2,000 years. The collapse came with the promise of modernity. The young people left the mountains for the cities, abandoning the ancient agricultural practices that had sustained their people for generations beyond counting. The terraces began to crumble, the irrigation systems to fail, the songs that had guided the planting and harvesting to be forgotten. But the mountains remembered. The Ofugo people had carved their terraces not just into the slopes, but into the very essence of the peaks themselves. The rice gods that had blessed the harvest were not diminished by the departure of their human partners. They waited, as they had always waited, for the time when the ancient compact would be renewed, when the mountains and their people would work together again. The old man Balanag had been the last to maintain the proper rituals, the last to know the songs that called the rain, the last to understand the relationship between the phases of the moon and the flooding of the terraces. He had died alone in his mountain hut, but his death had not been the end. The mountains themselves had taken up his songs, had carried them in the wind that moved through the abandoned terraces, had preserved them in the sound of water flowing, through channels that had been built by hands that had known the true nature of the sacred. Yet for all the forgetting, for all the abandonment, for all the turning away from the ancient understandings, the mountains endured. They endured not merely as geological features, not merely as obstacles to be overcome, or resources to be exploited, but as repositories of something that human civilization had once known but had gradually forgotten. The sacred presence that had dwelt in them for millennia did not dissipate with the departure of their human interpreters. It deepened, it concentrated, it waited in the Andes, where the wind still carried the scent of offerings burned on high altars. The stones themselves seemed to remember the prayers that had been spoken over them. The Spanish had built their churches on the foundations of Inca temples, but the stones had not forgotten their older purpose. The indigenous people who still lived in the shadow of the peaks could feel it, could sense the presence that lingered in the ancient walls, could hear the whispers of the ancestors who had shaped the sacred geometry of their civilization. The child Amaru had been born in the village of Ollantaytambo, where the massive stones of the Inca temple still stood in perfect alignment with the movements of the sun and stars. She had grown up hearing the stories that her grandmother told, stories of the time when the mountains had spoken directly to the people, when the stones had been alive with the breath of the gods. As she grew older, she began to understand that the stories were not just memories, but instructions. Not just entertainment, but a way of preserving the knowledge that would be needed. When the time came to remember, the archaeologists who came to study the ruins saw only the technical achievement, the precision of the stonework, the sophistication of the astronomical alignments, but they missed the deeper truth that the stones themselves held. The Inca had not built their temples to last for a few centuries, but for ages beyond counting. They had built them to preserve something that could not be preserved in any other way, something that would outlast the rise and fall of empires, something that would wait for the time when humanity would remember its true relationship with the sacred dot in Tibet, where the highest peaks on earth scraped the sky itself. The persistence of the sacred was more evident than anywhere else. The Chinese had come with their certainty and their need to control, but the mountains had absorbed their presence as they had absorbed all the others who had come before. The monasteries might be destroyed, the monks might be scattered, but the peaks themselves remained unchanged, their snow-covered summits still, serving as bridges between earth and sky, the prayer flags that had been strung across the passes for centuries continued to flutter in the wind, even when there was no one left to replace them. The mantras that had been carved into the rocks continued to resonate with the sound of the wind, even when there was no one left to speak them. The mountains themselves had become the repositories of the sacred, the keepers of the knowledge that human civilization had temporarily forgotten. 10. The last of the great lamas of the Rongbuk monastery had seen it in his final meditation before the soldiers came. He had seen the time when the mountains would stand alone, when their human interpreters would be scattered to the winds, when the ancient wisdom would be preserved only in the stones themselves. But he had also seen beyond that time to a future, when the mountains would call their children home, when the old knowledge would be remembered, when the sacred would reassert itself in ways that the modern world could not ignore. The collapse of the sacred understanding of mountains was not complete, could never be complete. It was too deeply embedded in the human psyche, too fundamental to the way that people had understood their place in the world. Even in the most urbanized societies, even among people who had never seen a mountain, the call of the peaks remained. It expressed itself in the longing for wilderness, in the need to escape the confines of civilization, in the persistence of the dream of the high places where the air was thin, and the presence of the divine could still be felt. The mountains had taught humanity its first lessons about the relationship between the human and the divine, about the nature of the sacred, about the proper way to approach the sources of power that dwelt beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. These lessons had been temporarily forgotten, but they had not been lost. They remained encoded in the stones themselves, in the flow of water down the mountainsides, in the movement of clouds around the peaks, in the sound of wind through the high passes, as the modern world began to confront the consequences of its separation from the sacred, as it began to understand that the exploitation of the natural world was not sustainable. The mountains began to call again, not with the same voice that they had used in the ancient world, but with a voice that could be heard by contemporary ears, a voice that spoke of the need to remember, the need to reconnect, the need to find again the path that had been lost. The ecological crisis that threatened the world in the 21st century was not merely a technical problem to be solved, but a spiritual crisis. A crisis of relationship, a crisis of understanding. The mountains had always known this. They had waited patiently for humanity to remember what it had forgotten, to rediscover the wisdom that had been preserved in the stones, to find again the way to live in harmony with the sacred forces that shaped the world, in the silence that had fallen over the sacred peaks, in the emptiness that had replaced the ancient rituals, in the forgetting that had covered the old knowledge like snow covers the high places in winter. Something was stirring. The mountains were beginning to speak again, not to the specialists and the scholars, but to anyone who was willing to listen, to anyone who was willing to approach them with the reverence that had once been the birthright of humanity. The age of forgetting was ending, and the age of remembering was about to begin. The mountains had waited long enough. They were ready to teach again, to guide again, to serve again as the bridges between earth and sky, between human and divine, between the world that was and the world that could be. The sacred was stirring in the stones, and the stones were beginning to sing. TTHE 20th century brought with it explorers, whose hearts beat with rhythms older than their own understanding. They came not as conquerors, but as pilgrims of curiosity, drawn by whispers that had traveled through generations of mountain folk, through the dreams of scholars, through the restless longing that lives in every human soul for something greater than the valleys they call home. In 1924, when the monsoon clouds hung low over the peaks of the Himalayas, a British expedition discovered carved stones, half buried in the scree slopes of a nameless summit. The symbols were neither Sanskrit nor Tibetan, neither Chinese nor any script known to the learned men who examined them. They seemed to pulse with their own inner life, as if the mountain itself were trying to speak through stone and time. Alexandra David Neal, that remarkable woman who walked among the peaks of Tibet as easily as others walked through their gardens, wrote in her journals of temples that appeared and vanished like mirages in the high-altitude air. She spoke of lamas who claimed their monasteries were built upon the foundations of structures so ancient that even their memory had grown fuzzy with age. When pressed for details, these holy men would only smile and point toward the highest peaks, where the snow never melted and the silence was so complete it seemed to have weight. The rediscovery was not a single moment, but a gradual awakening, like dawn breaking over mountain ridges. Each expedition, each careful excavation, each fragment of pottery or scrap of ancient textile added another note to a song that had been playing in silence for millennia. The archaeologists who came after the explorers brought with them tools of precision and methods of measurement, but they also brought something more precious, a willingness to listen to the mountain's own testimony in the Andes, where the air grows thin and the spirit grows large. Teams of researchers began to understand that what they had dismissed as primitive mountain worship was actually a sophisticated system of environmental knowledge. The terraces that climbed the mountainsides like giant staircases were not merely agricultural marvels, but astronomical calendars, water management systems, and sacred geometries, all woven into one. The ancient people had read the mountains like books, understanding their moods, their seasons, their gifts and their warnings. Giuseppe Tucci, the Italian scholar who spent years among the peaks of Central Asia, discovered manuscripts wrapped in silk and hidden in cave monasteries. When these texts were finally translated, they revealed not just religious doctrines, but detailed maps of spiritual geography, describing how the consciousness of mountain dwellers was shaped by altitude, by the quality of light at different elevations, by the subtle energies that flowed through stone and snow. The rediscovery was also deeply personal for those who participated in it. Anthropologist Robert Beer, studying the sacred art of Tibet, found himself dreaming of mandala patterns that he later discovered carved into rock faces at elevations where no human settlement should have been possible. When he showed photographs of these carvings to elderly Tibetan artists, their eyes would grow distant and they would murmur prayers, as if the images were not just decorative, but portals to understanding that their own generation had almost lost in the mountains of Japan, where Shinto and Buddhist traditions had layered themselves like geological strata over much older spiritual practices. Archaeologists began to find evidence of mountain pilgrimage routes that predated recorded history. Stone circles, carefully arranged, marked spots where natural acoustics created perfect resonance chambers. When researchers experimented with traditional chanting at these sites, the sounds seemed to awaken something in the mountain itself, as if the peaks were designed to amplify and transform human voices into something approaching the divine. The Cherokee people of the Appalachian Mountains, whose own traditions had been nearly silenced by centuries of suppression, began to share stories that their grandmothers had whispered in the darkness. They spoke of times when the mountains themselves were teachers, when certain peaks were known to call specific individuals for vision quests that could last days or lifetimes. When ethnobotanists studied the high meadows described in these stories, they found plant communities that existed nowhere else, species that seemed to have been cultivated by methods that modern science was only beginning to understand. The rediscovery revealed that the sacred mountains had never truly been lost, only hidden beneath layers of misunderstanding and neglect, like streams that run underground only to emerge as springs in unexpected places. The wisdom of mountain peoples had survived in fragments, in folk songs, in the instinctive knowledge that led certain individuals to climb toward the sky when their souls needed healing. Modern pilgrims began to retrace ancient routes, following paths that their ancestors had worn smooth with millions of footsteps. But these new seekers brought with them questions that would have been foreign to earlier generations. They wanted to understand not just what the mountains meant, but how they created meaning. Not just what rituals had been performed, but why. Those particular combinations of movement, breath, and intention had been chosen to harmonize human consciousness with the deep rhythms of stone and sky. The sacred mountains revealed themselves slowly, like shy creatures emerging from hidden places. Each generation of researchers, each serious pilgrim, each individual who approached the peaks with genuine reverence rather than mere curiosity, was granted glimpses of the vast understanding that had once flourished at high altitudes. But the mountains remained selective in their revelations, sharing their secrets only with those who had learned to listen with more than their ears, to see with more than their eyes, even as the 20th and 21st centuries brought new technologies of investigation, new methods of analysis, new ways of seeing and measuring and understanding. The sacred mountains retained their essential mystery. Some questions seemed to deepen rather than resolve with each attempt to answer them, as if the peaks themselves were designed to generate wonder rather than satisfy it. The question of the builders haunted every excavation, every discovery of ancient stonework at elevations that challenged modern engineering capabilities. How had massive stones been transported up slopes that left contemporary climbers gasping for breath? The theories multiplied like mountain echoes: sophisticated rope and pulley systems, techniques of stone splitting that had been forgotten, perhaps even methods of working with the mountain's own geological processes to move materials through natural fractures and fissures. But beyond the practical mysteries lay deeper puzzles that touched the heart of what it meant to be human in relationship with the natural world. The astronomical alignments found at sacred mountain sites were too precise to be accidental, yet they encoded knowledge that seemed to surpass what any isolated mountain culture should have been able to develop. Star maps carved in stone revealed familiarity with celestial cycles that required centuries of careful observation. Yet many of the sites showed evidence of having been abandoned and reoccupied multiple times throughout history. The mystery of consciousness itself seemed to thicken at high altitudes. Neurologists studying the effects of elevation on human perception discovered that the changes in brain chemistry caused by reduced oxygen were remarkably similar to the alterations induced by certain meditative practices. Had the ancient mountain dwellers developed their spiritual technologies specifically to work with these natural modifications of awareness? Were the sacred peaks not just temples, but sophisticated laboratories for exploring the outer reaches of human consciousness? Carbon dating of artifacts found in mountain caves often returned impossible results, with organic materials showing ages that contradicted their archaeological contexts. Some researchers suggested that the unique atmospheric conditions at high elevations might affect the decay of radioactive isotopes in ways that had not been accounted for. Others wondered if the mountains themselves somehow existed outside normal temporal flow, preserving objects and memories in states that conventional science had not yet learned to recognize. The mystery of the empty cities remained perhaps the most haunting of all. Site after site revealed evidence of communities that had simply vanished, leaving behind perfectly preserved temples, intricate water systems, and astronomical instruments of breathtaking precision, but no indication of where the inhabitants had gone or why they had left. Some settlements showed signs of having been evacuated in great haste, with valuable objects abandoned in place. Others seemed to have been deliberately prepared for departure, with ritual deposits and carefully sealed chambers that suggested the inhabitants expected to return. The Cherokee told stories of mountain peoples who had learned to walk the sky, paths traveling between peaks through routes that existed in dimensions parallel to the physical world. The Tibetans spoke of hidden valleys where time moved differently, where advanced practitioners could live for centuries without aging, emerging only rarely to share wisdom with the outer world. The Quechua people of the high Andes described cities that appeared only at certain times of year, when atmospheric conditions created doorways between the world of stone and the world of spirit. Modern researchers began to document anomalous phenomena that occurred with surprising regularity at sacred mountain sites. Electromagnetic readings that fluctuated in patterns that seemed to follow lunar cycles. Gravitational measurements that varied in ways that suggested the presence of large underground chambers or unusually dense mineral formations. Acoustic properties that created resonance patterns capable of inducing altered states of consciousness in sensitive individuals. The mystery of the maintenance also puzzled investigators. Many sacred mountain sites showed evidence of continuous care throughout periods when historical records indicated they had been abandoned. Stone circles remained perfectly aligned despite centuries of earthquakes and erosion. Water channels continued to flow despite the apparent absence of any human population to maintain them. Terraced gardens bore fruit despite having no apparent cultivators. Local peoples, when asked about these phenomena, would often respond with stories that blurred the line between history and legend. They spoke of guardian spirits who tended the sacred sites, of animals that had been trained by ancient masters to maintain certain pathways, of the mountains themselves as living beings capable of self-repair and renewal. Modern minds, trained to separate the rationale from the mystical, struggled to find comfortable categories for such explanations. The mystery of communication across vast distances troubled archaeologists who found identical symbols and similar architectural techniques at sacred mountain sites that were separated by thousands of miles and multiple mountain ranges. How had knowledge traveled between peaks in the Himalayas and mountains in the Americas? Some researchers proposed ancient global civilizations with more sophisticated travel capabilities than orthodox history acknowledged. Others suggested that the peaks themselves formed a kind of network, communicating through geological processes that human science was only beginning to recognize. The persistence of the mysteries seemed itself to be mysterious. Each generation of researchers approached the sacred mountains with confidence that new technologies and fresh perspectives would finally unlock their secrets. Yet the mountains seemed to reveal themselves in layers, each answer opening doorways to deeper questions, each solution creating new puzzles that challenged the very assumptions upon which the solutions had been based. The most profound mystery was perhaps the most simple. Why did the sacred mountains continue to call to human hearts across all cultures and centuries? What was it about certain peaks that made them irresistible to seekers, that drew prayers and pilgrimages, that inspired the construction of temples and the development of sophisticated spiritual technologies? The answer seemed to lie not in any particular attribute of the mountains themselves, but in something essential about the relationship between human consciousness and elevated places. Something so fundamental that it operated below the level of cultural conditioning or individual preference. The mountains kept their own counsel, revealing what they chose to reveal when they chose to reveal it. Each serious investigator, each genuine pilgrim, each individual who approached the peaks with appropriate humility was granted glimpses of understanding that seemed perfectly calibrated to their capacity to receive and integrate new knowledge. But the complete picture remained always just beyond reach, like a summit that seemed near but required one more day's climb, one more season's preparation, one more lifetime's dedication to approach. In the end, after all the expeditions and excavations, after all the theories and measurements, after all the attempts to capture the essence of the sacred mountains in words and photographs and scientific papers, something essential remained untouched by human understanding. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence that holds all sounds within itself. Not the darkness of absence, but the darkness from which all light emerges. The eternal silence of the sacred mountains was not a thing that could be disturbed by human presence or enhanced by human absence. It existed independent of the prayers that rose toward the peaks, independent of the ceremonies performed on their slopes, independent even of the civilizations that flourished and vanished in their shadows. It was the silence that had witnessed the first human eyes to gaze upon the mountains with wonder, and it would be the silence that remained when the last human heart ceased to beat with reverence for high places. This silence was not hostile to human aspiration. If anything, it seemed infinitely patient with the endless attempts to decode its meaning, to capture its essence, to make it serve human purposes of understanding and explanation. But it remained fundamentally untranslatable, like trying to pour an ocean into a cup or to contain the sky within the walls of a house. The silence was larger than any human framework that attempted to hold it. The modern pilgrims who climbed toward the sacred peaks often reported moments when this eternal silence broke through the noise of their own thoughts and expectations. It might happen at dawn, when the first light touched snow that had never known footprints. It might occur during the deepest part of night, when the stars seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. It might arrive without warning during the most ordinary moment of a difficult climb, when breath came hard and the body complained of altitude and exertion. In these moments, the pilgrims would later report, all questions ceased to matter. The mystery of who had carved the stones, who had aligned the temples, who had walked the ancient paths, became irrelevant beside the simple fact of presence, of being there in that moment with the mountain and the sky and the vast silence that held everything within itself. These were not experiences that could be photographed or measured or shared through any medium more substantial than the light that sometimes appeared in the eyes of those who had encountered the eternal silence directly. The silence seemed to exist at a frequency that human ears could not hear, but human hearts could receive. It was the sound of stone growing patient with time, the whisper of snow learning to hold its shape against the wind, the vast slow breathing of geological processes that operated on scales too large for individual human lifetimes to encompass. Those who learned to attune themselves to this frequency often found that their relationship with time itself began to change, that they could feel the presence of all the previous pilgrims who had stood in the same places, could sense the potential of all future seekers who would one day make the same journey toward understanding. The eternal silence was also the keeper of the true history of the sacred mountains. In its depths were held the memories of every ceremony ever performed, every prayer ever offered, every moment of genuine communion between human consciousness and the consciousness of the peaks themselves. This history was not recorded in any medium that archaeologists could excavate or scholars could interpret, but it existed nonetheless, preserved in the very substance of the mountains like songs embedded in crystal dot. The indigenous peoples who still maintained relationships with the sacred mountains spoke of this silence as the first teacher, the source from which all other wisdom flowed. They understood that the external silence of the peaks was a reflection of an internal silence that every human being carried within themselves, and that the purpose of pilgrimage was not to find something new, but to remember something eternally present that the noise of ordinary life had temporarily obscured. The sacred mountains, in their eternal silence, served as mirrors for human consciousness itself. Each generation of seekers found in the peaks a reflection of their own spiritual aspirations and limitations. The mountains revealed exactly what each visitor was prepared to see, no more and no less. This was why the same peak could appear as a simple geographical feature to one observer, and as a gateway to transcendent understanding to another. The mountain remained unchanged. What varied was the depth and quality of attention that each observer brought to the encounter. The silence also held within itself all the unasked questions, all the problems that human minds had not yet learned to formulate. It was pregnant with possibilities, with understandings that waited for consciousness capable of receiving them. The sacred mountains were not just repositories of ancient wisdom, but laboratories for the evolution of human awareness itself. Places where the familiar boundaries between inner and outer, between self and environment, between time and eternity could be safely explored and transcended. In the eternal silence, the distinction between sacred and ordinary dissolved. The peaks revealed that every mountain, every hill, every elevated place held the potential for transformation if approached with appropriate attention and reverence. The sacredness was not a quality that some mountains possessed and others lacked, but a relationship that could be established anywhere human. Consciousness met the natural world with genuine openness and respect. The modern world, with its emphasis on noise and speed and constant stimulation, had largely forgotten how to listen to this kind of silence. But the sacred mountains continued to offer their ancient invitation to anyone willing to make the journey, to anyone ready to exchange the familiar comforts of knowing for the vast adventure of unknowing. They stood as beacons for a different way of being human, a way that recognized the profound intelligence embedded in natural systems, the wisdom that could only be accessed through direct, wordless communion with the earth itself, the eternal. Silence was ultimately the silence of love, not love as human beings usually understood it, but love as the fundamental force that held all existence together, the attraction that drew consciousness toward ever greater understanding and integration. The sacred mountains embodied this love in their patient endurance, their willingness to serve as teachers and guardians and sources of inspiration for any being capable of receiving their gifts. This love required nothing and gave everything. It made no demands and imposed no conditions. It simply was, as present in the moment of greatest human understanding as in the moment of deepest confusion, as available to the most sophisticated scholar as to the simplest child who looked up at a mountain peak with wonder in their eyes. Today, as humanity faces challenges that require wisdom beyond what any single culture or generation has possessed, the sacred mountains continue their ancient function as teachers and guides. Climate change reveals the delicate balance that the mountain peoples understood intuitively. The recognition that human welfare and environmental health are not separate concerns but aspects of a single, integrated system. The wisdom embedded in terraced agriculture, in sustainable water management, in the careful observation of natural cycles, offers insights that modern environmental science is only beginning to fully appreciate. The sacred mountains also offer something that technological solutions alone cannot provide, a framework for understanding human beings as part of something larger than themselves, as participants in a cosmic process that operates on scales both intimate and vast. In a world increasingly dominated by artificial environments and virtual experiences, the peaks stand as reminders of the deep nourishment that comes from direct contact with elemental forces, from breathing thin air and feeling the sun's intensity, magnified by altitude and snow. New generations of seekers continue to make pilgrimages to the sacred mountains, but their journeys often begin differently than those of their predecessors. They may start not from villages at the base of familiar peaks but from cities around the world, connected by airlines and internet searches and guidebooks that promise spiritual transformation. Yet when they actually reach the mountains, when they begin the slow work of climbing toward understanding, they discover that the essential experience remains unchanged. The confrontation with their own limitations, the gradual expansion of what they believed possible, the moment-by-moment choice between ego and humility that defines all genuine spiritual work. The mountains teach patience to a generation accustomed to instant gratification, teach simplicity to minds trained in complexity, teach presence to consciousness scattered among multiple screens and constant distractions. These lessons cannot be downloaded or streamed or purchased. They must be earned through the slow, often uncomfortable process of placing one foot in front of another, of breathing consciously when breath becomes difficult, of continuing to climb when every muscle argues for rest. The sacred mountains also serve as bridges between ancient wisdom and contemporary need. The meditation practices developed at high altitudes prove remarkably effective for dealing with modern stress and anxiety. The ecological knowledge preserved by mountain cultures offers crucial insights for addressing climate change and environmental degradation. The community structures that sustained mountain civilizations provide models for building more sustainable and equitable social systems. But perhaps most importantly, the sacred mountains continue to offer direct access to mystery itself, too. The recognition that existence contains dimensions that cannot be measured or captured or fully explained. In a culture that often mistakes information for wisdom, that confuses data with understanding, the peaks stand as monuments to the value of direct experience, of wordless knowing, of the kind of intelligence that can only be cultivated through patient attention to what lies beyond the reach of conceptual thought. The eternal silence of the sacred mountains is not threatened by the noise of modern civilization. If anything, it has become more precious as a refuge for consciousness, seeking respite from constant stimulation and demand. The peaks offer not an escape from the world, but a place to remember what the world actually is beneath all human construction. An interpretation, a living system of incredible complexity and beauty, a manifestation of creative forces that operate on scales that make human concerns seem both infinitely important and ultimately insignificant. The call of the sacred mountains continues to sound in human hearts, sometimes as a whisper, sometimes as an undeniable summons that reorganizes an entire life around the necessity of making the journey toward understanding. This call is not bound by geography or culture or religious tradition. It arises wherever consciousness recognizes its own vastness, wherever the human spirit refuses to accept limitation as the final word about what is possible. The mountains are patient. They have waited through ice ages and continental drift, through the rise and fall of countless civilizations, through periods when they were revered and periods when they were ignored. They can wait through whatever transformations humanity must navigate in the centuries ahead. But they also remain available, moment by moment, for any individual ready to begin the ancient journey toward the place where human understanding meets, the eternal silence that holds all things within itself. In the end, the sacred mountains teach the most essential lesson of all, that the journey itself is the destination, that the seeking is the finding, that the question asked with a genuinely open heart contains within itself the seed of every answer worth knowing. They stand as eternal invitations to remember what human beings can become when they allow themselves to be taught by forces larger and wiser than their individual minds, when they accept their proper place in the vast community of existence. That includes not only all living beings, but the stones and snow and sky itself. The sacred mountains continue to call, continue to offer their gifts to any consciousness capable of receiving them. Their ancient silence holds within itself all the songs that have ever been sung, all the prayers that have ever been offered, all the possibilities that have ever been imagined. They are, in their eternal presence, both a promise and a fulfillment, both a question and an answer, both the path and the destination for every soul that has ever looked upward and wondered what it might mean to climb toward the place where earth meets sky, and in their patient endurance, in their willingness to serve as teachers and guardians for any being ready to learn what they have to offer. The sacred mountains embody the deepest truth about existence itself. That love is the force that holds all things together. That wisdom is available to every consciousness willing to receive it, and that the universe itself is structured as an invitation to endless growth, endless discovery, endless communion with the mystery that calls each being home to its true nature. The eternal silence waits, holding everything within itself, offering everything to those who can learn to listen with more than their ears, to see with more than their eyes, to know with more than their minds. The sacred mountains stand as monuments to this silence, as doorways to this knowing, as bridges between the world of form and the formless source from which all worlds arise. They are, in their unchanging presence, humanity's most patient teachers and most faithful friends, offering their wisdom freely to any heart humble enough to receive it, any spirit bold enough to make the journey toward understanding. In the deep quiet of mountain dawn, in the vast stillness of high-altitude night, in the moment when breath becomes prayer and prayer becomes breath, the eternal silence reveals its greatest secret, that it was never separate from the seeker, that the journey toward the sacred mountains was always a journey home to one's own deepest nature, that the silence that holds all things within itself lives as much in human hearts as in the stone and snow of the highest peaks. The sacred mountains continue their eternal teaching, offering their gifts to each new generation of seekers, holding space for the transformations that occur when human consciousness allows itself to be reshaped by contact with forces larger than the personal self. They stand as reminders that the sacred is not something to be achieved, but something to be recognized, not something to be grasped, but something to be surrendered to, not something to be conquered, but something to be joined in the endless dance of existence itself. And so the story continues, will always continue, as long as human hearts beat with the ancient rhythm that recognizes kinship with stone and sky, as long as consciousness seeks to know itself through communion with the vast intelligence that moves through all things. The sacred mountains wait, patient and eternal, ready to receive each new pilgrim, each new seeker, each new soul ready to discover what it means to stand at the place where earth meets heaven and find they're not two separate realms, but one seamless whole, one living presence, one eternal silence that speaks more eloquently than any words of the love that holds all existence within its perfect embrace. If this story stayed with you as you drifted off, support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. We release weekly journeys into the forgotten, and every dreaming soul is welcome here.